Chapter 2479. He stuffed her back onto the bed. He conveniently pulled the blanket over her body. Yiyuxuan was like a serious worker. His fingers were very professional and gentle as he smoothed her long hair. He didn't want to get a headache from being pressed down. Wei Bai stared at him obediently. Although she forced her eyelids open, she still wanted to sleep. How could she sleep so much? She had slept for 3 days and still wanted to sleep. However, Wei Bai thought about what had happened in the past 3 days. She had lived in this world for so many years and had so many worries. It was natural for her to feel sleepy. Although she had a realistic body and didn't need to work. But she was mentally exhausted. Yiyuxuan sat by the bed, turned off the lights and turned on the small bedside lamp. He leaned against the bed and lowered his head. His movements were casual and elegant as he reached out and gently stroked her long hair. His dark and hoarse voice had a sexy texture in the dark night. Go to sleep. If you can't sleep, I'll tell you a fairy tale. Wei Bai's mouth twitched. Who liked fairy tales? She wanted to hear adult. Cough cough cough. Don't ask. If you ask again, the comments will fly. Wei Bai stared at him for a long time under the dim light. His side profile was perfect and hazy, like the beauty of an elf in the dark night. It was very impactful. Wei Bai quickly blinked and shook off the temptation of the beauty in front of her. Then she asked, "Are you really having insomnia?" Yiyuxuan's eyes were too bright. He was so energetic. Waiting for her to fall asleep. He probably wouldn't be able to sleep. She didn't know why, but she imagined him sitting alone in the dark. He looked like he was alone and lonely. Thinking of this, she felt a little embarrassed that she fell asleep so carelessly. It was better to ask politely. This way he wouldn't seem so cold and heartless when he fell asleep later. Yiyuxuan didn't answer. Instead, he stared at her quietly. His eyes were a deep black, but because of some kind of emotion, this darkness seemed incomparably soft. Finally, he lowered his head and gently kissed her forehead. Then he murmured against her skin, "Then I can sleep." A simple kiss on the forehead. That would allow him to escape from the nightmare that had lasted for nearly 1,000 years. The most difficult part was that he had spent 100 years raising her with everything he had. She was hidden in an emotionless lotus flower. It was too difficult. Even if Yiyuxuan thought about it now. They all felt pain and discomfort and were close to collapse. What hurt him the most was that the moment he awakened, he saw her destroying his 100 years of hard work. He turned around and left. That cold back view was just like the one in his countless dreams. He had never stopped even once. As long as her soul could leave, it didn't matter how long she stayed. She wanted to leave. Through the dream world he selfishly felt that it was good. But after following him in the past he could better understand the heavy sorrow. This was also why he lost control and pulled her into that dangerous place. Just to scare her. This was a wrong thing to do. Yiyuxuan calmly reflected on himself. He definitely couldn't do such a thing to her next time. Especially since that golden-eyed body had another huge force. Moreover, Yiyuxuan's calm eyes were extremely repressed. Her experience in the dream was probably due to her repressed feelings. Otherwise she wouldn't have been affected so little. Was it done by that thing that was neither male nor female? Yiyuxuan's brain was used to calculating and reasoning again. Before he could figure it out, someone tugged at his sleeve. The force made his cufflinks crooked. Yiyuxuan blinked his eyes a little sluggishly, and then finally lowered his head to look at her. He found that half of Wei Bai's face was hidden under the blanket, revealing a pair of sparkling eyes, like a cute little animal. She spoke tentatively. "Why don't we sleep together?" Yiyuxuan looked at her silently and didn't answer, but his dark eyes became dangerous. Wei Bai said, "You can't sleep. If you can't sleep, you can still chat with me." Yiyuxuan realized that he was wrong. Sleeping together turned out to be purely about sleeping together. He could only blame himself for having such a deep experience after going with her soul. Those messy and sweet experiences still remained in his bones. Thinking of her charming appearance in the lotus, his Adam's apple couldn't help but move. Yiyuxuan suppressed his rapid breathing rate and slowly lifted the blanket. Then he lay down on the bed. The next moment, a warm and soft body burrowed into his arms. A muffled voice came from under the blanket. "You can sleep if I hug you." Yiyuxuan's body stiffened a little and then he relaxed. He couldn't help but smile a little more. Then he lowered his head and kissed her hair. "Yes, I can sleep if you hug me." To make it easier for you to read it next time, you can click at the bottom to record this reading. Chapter 2480. Wei Bai stayed longer this time. She left it especially for Yiyuxuan. It was specially left for Yiyuxuan. This sentence had to be emphasized. After all, her father didn't let her stay for more than a few days. For Yi Yuxuan's insomnia, she had to stay up late with him every time. In the end, she had to hug him to sleep. She was afraid that Yi Yuxuan would trick her. She even asked the system to check if he was asleep. The system said, "Yes, he's asleep." After receiving the system's affirmative answer, Wei Wei Bai nodded in satisfaction. It was good that he was asleep. At first, she didn't think it was a big deal to have another person on the bed. The two of them slept peacefully in each other's arms for a few days. When she felt that it was about time and planned to leave the next day, she woke up in the middle of the night. She didn't know if it was because she was thinking about something. She couldn't help but look up at Yi Yuxuan to see if he was asleep. After all, the system also needed to sleep sometimes. If Yi Yuxuan woke up while the system was sleeping, what would she do if he couldn't sleep? In the middle of the night, the lights were dim. Most of Yi Yuxuan's arm was pressed down by her head, while the other hand was placed on her back. Usually he was always cold and aloof. But when he was asleep, he was still cold. Especially after hugging him to sleep for a few days, his complexion was visibly better. Even the lost color on his lips was thicker, like a rose blooming in the dark night, cold and beautiful. Wei Wei Bai stared at him for a long time. She made sure that his breathing was stable and that he had no intention of waking up. Only then did she let out a sigh of relief. Wei Wei Bai held her breath and quickly called the system. "System, let's go, let's go." The system was woken up. He rubbed his eyes and pulled the woolen hat on his head. Then he yawned and said to the host, "Okay, close your eyes." Bai Wei Wei immediately closed her eyes. Her vision turned black and she lost consciousness. The system's tiny hands and feet carefully carried her white soul out. He didn't know if it was an illusion. The white soul seemed to have an additional layer of faint gold. Just as the system took him into its arms, it saw Yi Yuxuan open his eyes. His dark and deep eyes were filled with a cold vigilance. Tong Qing shuddered and almost threw the host's soul out. Not sleeping in the middle of the night, was she trying to scare Tong to death? Yi Yuxuan stared at the system in silence for a while before whispering, "Take good care of her." The system immediately nodded obediently. Then it hugged the host and took a few steps back. Without another word, it started to run. Deep in the night on a soft bed. Crossover system, Adonis, come here. Crossover system, Adonis, come here. / crossover system. Adonis, come here. Download crossover system. Adonis, come here. Mobile the below to record this reading record. Crossover system. Adonis, come here. Chapter 2481. Wei Wei Bai slept peacefully in his arms, but her soul was no longer here. Yi Yuxuan's clear eyes didn't have the drowsiness of having just woken up. He reached out and touched his lips with his fingertips. The kiss she left just now was still there. He exerted strength in his arms and pulled her completely into his embrace. The warmth of her body close to his made him squint. Then he lowered his head, took her lips and kissed her deeply. He was afraid of scaring her, so he kept a quiet and obedient image. But in essence he was still the aggressive and possessive kind of person. In the past he had no emotional fluctuations. He didn't understand anything. Now he slowly understood. He also knew why his personality was more paranoid and crazy in every dream. Maybe, in his nature, this kind of personality took up most of the time. Yi Yuxuan let go of her, but his embrace was still strong. His lips rubbed against her hair, full of her scent. His deep eyes were stained with a bit of broken light, full of satisfaction and deep. Then Yi Yuxuan slowly closed his eyes, not relying on sleeping pills. It was fine as long as he hugged her to sleep. Wei Wei Bai heard a rumbling sound, and a strange stench pervaded the air. Before she opened her eyes, her eyelids twitched. It seemed like the environment was a bit bad. Then she finally opened her tired eyelids and found herself sitting on a shabby mahogany chair inlaid with bronze. The style of this chair, although shabby, was gorgeous. It was similar to the structure of Rococo. She was wearing an extremely dark robe. The robe was the kind that had no lines and there was even a hood on the back. In front of her was a large pot. Thick green liquid was slowly boiling, making a rumbling sound. Some splashed out from time to time. It fell to the floor, corroding a terrible mark. Next to the pot was a desk, and there were all kinds of strange materials on the table. There were also plants, dried snakes, and lizards in a mess. In the middle of the table was a thick stack of parchment books. A quill was casually dipped in ink and thrown on top of the notebook. This strange environment was so strange that Wei Wei Bai was stunned. He had never seen such a style of plain decoration before. She forced herself to move her neck and called out. The system immediately responded, "Coming, do you want to receive the memory?" Wei Wei Bai felt that her neck was a little sore. Perhaps it was because she had fallen asleep in the chair. Receive. Although this environment looked strange, she was the only one here. He didn't seem to be in any danger. Except for the pot of green cuisine. Familiar memories flooded into her mind, and her patience increased a lot. The headache wasn't that bad either. With great difficulty she sorted out the memories in her mind. Was she a witch on this plane? The identity of a witch sounded like it was tied to a stake. She thought of the fate of those who were labeled as witches in history. Wei Wei Bai felt a chill run down her spine. This was a special plane. It was a world of Western magic. There were all kinds of strange creatures that Wei Wei Bai had never seen before. There were also elves, mermaids, magicians, dragons and so on. Two of the biggest forces had fought on this continent for 1,000 years. They were the witches and the light magicians. In the end, the light magicians succeeded and killed more than 90% of the witches. Then they established the Church of Light. They specialized in capturing and killing the remaining witches who escaped. Chapter 2482. In this plane, Bai Weiwei had the identity of a witch, but a very inferior kind of witch. Because her mother was a witch before she was killed by the Church of Light. She left everything to her only daughter. But her daughter was a bad student and could not do anything. She used up a lot of good things from the witches, and was forced into a corner by the Church of Light. She finally gave up on herself. She used all the materials and planned to make her own witch servant. Then she killed the archbishop of the church to avenge her mother. The so-called witch servant was a puppet made with the spells of the necromancer and the witch's secret medicine. The puppet would only listen to its master. And the power of the puppet was determined by the corpse. If the corpse was a light mage when it was alive. In that case the refined puppet would also be a light mage. The original owner went to the mass grave and searched for a long time, and finally used some equipment to measure the fluctuation of light magic on a corpse. Although the fluctuation was a little strange. But there was still light magic. With light magic one could enter the church and not be discovered. Then they could kill the archbishop who killed their mother. So the original owner rolled up her sleeves and made the secret medicine, but in the process, she failed and died. She died too casually. Was this the treatment of a roadside cannon fodder? Wei Wei Bai felt pain in her neck because the corpse's neck happened to hit the chair. Wei Wei Bai could not help but reach out to rub her poor neck. But she found that she was holding something in her hand. It was heavy and smooth. She looked down blankly and found that she was holding a thigh bone, a human thigh bone. The bright white color was simply dazzling to the eyes. Wei Wei Bai, then her fingers trembled and she wanted to throw it. But she heard the system say, "This is the male lead's thigh bone, don't throw it or he will be a cripple." Wei Wei Bai had a bad feeling in her heart. What the hell? The system said, "Look behind the cauldron." Wei Wei Bai grabbed the thigh bone and walked behind the cauldron with a strange expression. Then he saw a chair appear. On the chair, a human skeleton appeared. He had long legs and long arms and his height was very standard. The skull's face shape was also standard. If it had meat it would be the face of a handsome guy. Of course, no matter how standard it was still a skeleton. No wonder she would have nightmares about skeletons when she returned to reality from the previous dimension. Was that the legendary Omen dream? Ding. Target Shaya West. This mission is to obtain Shaya West's love. Target Shaya West. Progress, 0. Time, temporary. The corners of Wei Wei Bai's mouth twitched. What, Sire West? He's just Skeleton West. How do we attack this place? Just tell us how. Not only did he die, he even turned into a skeleton. Strategy my ass. Wei Wei Bai raised her hand and was about to throw away the heavy bone in her finger. But thinking of something, she suppressed the violent primitive power in her body and carefully put the leg bone back on Shaya's leg. A perfect skeleton. It was an eyesore. The system said earnestly, "Let's just say he's the male lead." I didn't guess wrong. Wei Wei Bai, it doesn't matter if the time is fixed, but how do I attack a dead person? Do I have to summon his soul? The system thought for a while and finally thought, didn't the information say to make a puppet? You can try. Wei Wei Bai, a puppet is also a dead thing. Isn't it just a marionette? Chapter 2483. Even if a puppet could move, it would not have feelings. The system said, there is a 1 in 10 chance that the puppet will gain sentience, but the potion needs to be especially successful. Wei Wei Bai thought about those memories, then ran to the table and flipped through the notes. After a quick look, he did find some specific opportunities. A witch's servant would have their own sentience when they were alive. However, it was very dangerous to awaken the servant's sentience. Because once the servant had a lot of power and remembered what happened when they were alive, then the servant could break free from the power of the contract and could even kill the witch. Many witches would avoid the danger of awakening their servant's sentience. Wei Wei Bai narrowed her eyes and finally said, "System, you do it. This potion needs precise calculation. It's too difficult for a human. Especially since she was not a witch. She did not have black magic. The stability of her fingers was not enough to control the data of the potion." The system said, "Okay, I'll get you a small scale and then I'll calculate the data of the potion. You just need to throw the potion into the pot." Wei Wei Bai rolled up her sleeves and nodded in agreement. As she began to fumble with the potion, the skeleton on the seat slowly emitted golden light spots. The light spots were hidden in the bones, and could not be seen clearly if one did not look carefully. When Shaya regained consciousness, he saw a petite figure running back and forth. When he went through the undead phase, he was attacked by the dragons, causing him to fall into the crack of time and space as a necromancer's final form. The final form of a necromancer was a skeleton. He did not know how long he had lost consciousness. Was this a witch's house? He could not move and he could not even control his vision. His empty eyes were dark and the places he could see were fixed. Everywhere he looked there were little things hanging there. They were all shabby, not worth mentioning, and looked like trash. If this was really a witch's house, it was too shabby. Also, shouldn't witches be destroyed? Before he awakened his power, he gave the order to destroy witches. He should have been gone for a few years, but those useless people from the church still haven't done what he ordered? A trace of dark red light flashed through Shaya's dark eyes. He sat quietly on the old classical wooden chair. His slender fingers rested silently on his leg bones. The cold bones had a layer of beautiful moonlight luster. He tried to move his finger, but found that the binding power of the dragon clan was too strong. He wanted to digest the power in his body. It would take some time. Once the power of the dragon clan was fully digested, it would be the death of the dragon clan. Shaya's neck drooped. He was quiet and cold. His pale skull gave off a delicate and smooth feeling. Wei Wei Bai and the system were seriously staring at the potion. Wei Wei Bai casually asked, "What is the identity of this Shaya guy?" The system glanced at the information. "Shaya just, none." The system replied. "He probably died too long ago, so he doesn't have an identity." Not only was the time waiting, but the male lead's information was also gone. Yixian's dog couldn't have followed him over, right? He was simply a big wolf dog that would not let go of its host. Wei Wei Bai felt that perhaps he had really died for too long. After all, there was not a single bit of decay on his bones. He was probably a passerby in the past. This was also good. There was no conflict of interest or hatred. Wei Wei Bai carefully threw the last bit of the potion into the pot. Chapter 2484. The system was a little guilty because it couldn't find the male lead's information. It glanced at the supermarket. Wow, there was the first beauty medal. Wait, there was also the magic immunity medal of the Church of Light. They were all discounted and the price was about the same. He counted his little treasury. He could buy one and get snacks as a gift. It was a good deal. So he immediately said, "The side reward is here. This time you have a choice. There is the first beauty medal and the immunity medal of the Church of Light. Which one do you want?" After that, the system felt that it still had to give a suggestion. "The light medal is good. You are now being hunted and will be tied up and burned by the church. With the medal you can leave and become a light mage." In this plane the host was actually in danger. Witches were killed without mercy on sight. Wei Wei Bai also thought about it seriously, then she compromised and said, "Indeed, the light medal is too useful for me. I don't have any ability now and I am still a witch. If I am caught I will definitely die, so..." The system was just about to buy the light medal. It heard the host shout firmly, "I want the first beauty." The system, the host waved his fist and said, "For the first beauty, what is death?" The system, the host was so excited that he almost burst his clothes. "Money is precious but the value of life is higher. If it is for beauty I will throw it all away." The system, "Why do you want to block the host?" It couldn't control the urge to cut ties with the host. After a few minutes of calmness, the system finally pressed the button to buy the first beauty medal with tears in his eyes. The purchase of the light medal came with a small biscuit. The first beauty didn't. His heart was aching. Wei Wei Bai heard a ding sound and the first beauty medal entered her body. The system said weakly, "All right, your appearance has changed. No matter whether the people in this plane have seen you or not, your appearance has always been like this since you were young. Even if there is a portrait, it will automatically change and refresh." to ensure that the host's changed appearance would not reveal any flaws. No matter how the information was checked. She had been like this since she was young. As for why the first beauty didn't cause a sensation, this question the discounted metal didn't care. It only cared about the beauty modification, not the evaluation of outsiders. While Wei Bai was waiting for the metal to activate, the potion was also completed. Such a large pot of dark and terrifying cuisine was turned into a small bottle of purple potion. She picked up the potion and turned to leave, but her robe was too long. She stepped on the wrong foot and threw herself forward. Afraid that she would drop the potion, she raised her hands high and face down. Then he thought of her face, the face of the number one beauty. Immediately, a huge burst of energy erupted from his body. He exerted force in his legs and threw himself even further away. His entire body crashed into the skeleton's ribs. It was even more painful than falling to the ground. Wei Bai held the potion in one hand and covered her face with the other. Her petite body was almost lying on skeleton's knee. Her long hair fell into the gap between her ribs. Her brown curly hair intertwined with her white bones, giving her a strange sense of beauty. Wei Bai only felt that it was horrifying. She touched her nose and tears rolled out of her eyes because of the pain. Then she raised her head and saw the skull coldly staring at her with its pitch-black eyes. If she didn't know that he was dead, she would have thought that he was looking at her. Because of the pain, she frowned and her lips were tightly pursed. Then she carefully observed the potion, worried that it would spill. In Shaya's line of sight, the petite girl was lying on his body. She slightly raised her curly thick eyelashes, and the corners of her eyes were wet with mist. Her soft white skin was stained with a blush, making her look exceptionally charming. She seemed to be aware of something. Her watery eyes looked up, revealing her white and flawless neck under the large and ill-fitting robe. The thin lines of her shoulders and neck were delicate and would break with a snap. Like the crystal bottle he used to place in his room as a decoration, the red rose stuck in the bottle and stained with the morning mist. Too beautiful to be real. His pitch-black eyes flashed with a strange red light. Wei Bai didn't see it. She just happened to pour the potion into his mouth. The purple potion instantly soaked the skeleton's body. Wei Bai also heard it. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 5. She was just about to wonder why there was a favorability. Then she heard it again. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 0. By Wei. At the read at https://www.sashu.com// read at https://m/sashu.com. Chapter 2485. The magic potion had just been poured in and he already had a change in favorability? The effect of the potion here was so awesome? Or was it because it was digested with bones so there was no middleman and it could take effect in 1 second? Just now, the purple magic potion entered his mouth. The liquid was like when it was alive, directly rushing into his bones and every bone turned purple. The purple light covered the pale white bones, strange and gorgeous. Wei Bai stood at the side, watching the purple light suddenly being wrapped in a golden-gray fog. On the pale white bones, countless golden-gray fog was rolling. The internal organs and flesh quickly attached to the bones and grew. Golden-gray light spots filled the sky. In the countless light spots on the slender body, pure white and flawless skin appeared with a sickly exquisite feeling. Beautiful fingers without a single callus. Like the white rose petals raised by nobles, the silk-like delicate fingertips gracefully and naturally hung down. Under the thick and fluffy honey-colored curly hair, under the young man's half-closed eyelashes, a pair of gray-purple eyes hazy with a deep sexiness. His thin lips were as red as a rose, and even without a smile, there was a kind of breathtaking charm. He was delicate, perfect, and had nothing to do with frailty. It made Wei Bai touch her face suspiciously. Could it be that the system gave the number 1 beauty medal to the wrong person? This brother of Shaya's was too beautiful. His naked body was like a work of art meticulously sculpted by the creator. Golden ratio, purple eyes, exquisite appearance. Wei felt a little jealous. What was going on? If they walked out together, she would definitely be suppressed by him without explanation. She glanced at the middle of his legs, stab. That undisguised gaze made the motionless puppet-like young man's eyes darken. As expected, a licentious and evil witch. She was actually so licentious and shameless. Ding, the male lead's favorability is -2. Wei Bai. She wanted to calm down, she didn't do anything right? She didn't kill his family, she didn't stab him. She didn't say she loved him while stabbing him. Why did the favorability drop for no reason? And wasn't the magic potion not completely digested? How can the favorability increase and decrease? Could it be that the consciousness came first and then the body moved? Wei Bai looked down at him strangely. His eyelashes didn't move and his eyes were dull. He was like a corpse. She stood in front of him, curiously tilted her head, her long brown curly hair fell to her shoulders, and her expression was extremely focused. But because her appearance was too sweet, instead of the uncomfortable feeling of observation, instead it was a kind of softly rubbing the depths of her eyes. The young man couldn't move his line of sight as he looked into her curious and adorable eyes. The girl's eyes were not like those of other witches who had turned black because they had learned dark magic. Instead it was a kindness. Her hair color was similar to his. This color. This little witch's black magic must be extremely bad. The more powerful one's black magic was, the darker the color of their hair and eyes would be. She must be lazy and not put in any effort to study. This kind of trash is more annoying than evil witches. Ding, the male lead's favorability is -5. By Wei Wei. At the crossover system. Adonis, come here and read the full article at https://www.sashu.com. Download Transmigration system. Adonis, come here and read this on your phone. https://m. Sashu.com. To facilitate your next reading, you can click on at the bottom to record this reading. Quick. Chapter 2486. Fuck you, what's wrong with her? She didn't molest him yet. She didn't pinch his white and tender face either. She also didn't pull his hair to see if it was sturdy or if it would fall off. Why did the favorability drop again? Wei Bai asked the system what was going on. The system observed and finally managed to deduce a possibility. Probably he's conscious but he can't move his body, and he's in a bad mood when he sees that he's not wearing any clothes. The male lead's information was incomplete, so there was no way to observe. But as a powerful leader, how could he say something as degrading as "I don't know"? Would it become a Sherlock Holmes system in the future? This made the system feel that life was very difficult. Wei Bai sized up his body. Indeed, it was naked. Ding, the male lead's favorability is -7. Wei Bai, I'm about to lose control and tear the white skeleton. The favorability dropping is addictive, and it can't be stopped, right? If it drops again, do you believe that I'll throw you into the mass grave again? Ding, the male lead's favorability is -10. Uncle Ancestor. I'll go find clothes for you now. Wei Bai immediately turned around and went to search for clothes. For the sake of the favorability, it could only endure. Xiaya's beautiful eyes drooped, the cold grayish purple in his half-closed eyes were as beautiful as violets. Although he knew that the evil witch was incomparably licentious. But this was the first time he met someone who dared to be so rude to him. Without any shyness, extremely daring. Directly staring at him, daring to look at his. Xiaya's drooping eyes looked at his fingers, no longer in the form of a skeleton, but in the form of a human. That magic medicine clashed with the power of the dragon race. It digested a portion of the dragon race's power. It freed him from his undead state and restored his human appearance. But he still couldn't move. Xiaya quietly drooped his head, his honey-colored curly hair scattered down, and his hazy eyes could be faintly seen. The youth was like an exquisite piece of art. Even if he sat quietly, it was enough to make people go crazy. But no one could see how terrifying the power in his body was. And this power, because of the conflict, caused him to suffer intense pain. Xiaya's grayish-purple eyes showed signs of forbearance. Suddenly, a slightly cold hand landed lightly on his shoulder. Xiaya was unable to move. He could only feel the temperature of the girl's fingertips, bringing about a delicate sensation. She draped the coat over him. He even said indifferently, "You'll have to put up with these clothes. I'm very poor, so I'll have to trouble you." This was the first time Xiaya had heard someone say the words, "I am very poor," in such a calm and natural tone. Most of them were just trying to look impressive. Saying that they were poor was like insulting the poor. Under his lowered gaze, the girl's fingertips meticulously buttoned his shirt. After much difficulty, he finally finished putting on the pants for the puppet boy. Wei Bai wiped her sweat. It didn't look heavy, but it took a lot of energy just to move it. The clothes belonged to the lover of the original owner's mother before she died. Witches had many lovers because of their practice of black magic. As a result, it would affect one's temperament and cause one to become abnormally reckless. He didn't even know who the original owner's father was. So there were many men's clothes in the house of different sizes. The witches of this world represented evil, licentious, reckless, crazy and terrifying. Wei Wei Bai finished taking care of the clothes. Then she went to wash the pot. This pot hadn't been washed since it was bought. Wei Wei Bai expressed that she couldn't bear it. Moreover, the house was in such a mess, how could he live? Chapter 2487. She couldn't control it. Although she wasn't a clean freak, she was still a normal person. She didn't have money to hire a maid, and her identity needed to be hidden. Wei Wei Bai could only roll up her sleeves and do the housework herself. More importantly, where did she hide the mirror? After searching for half a day, she still didn't know where to throw it. She hadn't seen the face of her number one beauty yet. The quiet boy was still sitting on the chair like a delicate corpse. The girl was wearing a long robe, clumsily tidying things. She was trying to clean the floor. She took a cloth and squatted on the ground, trying to wipe the dirt. When she brushed against Shaya's feet, she reached out, grabbed his bare feet and lifted them up. Then she wiped the floor. Shaya. She didn't even know how to clean up? Wei Wei Bai finally found a mirror after cleaning the house. She picked it up and looked at herself. Her lips were red and her teeth were white. Her skin was so delicate that water could be squeezed out of it. A pair of amber eyes, sweet even if they weren't smiling. Long eyelashes, when trembling, cast a delicate shadow under her eyes. The people in this world had a Western-style appearance. The lines of her face were softer, and there was a subtle beauty of the East. Although she looked pleasing to the eye, she was quite pretty. But the appearance of the number one beauty that could cause the downfall of countries and make people go crazy was too far. Wasn't this the enhanced version of the pretty girl next door? The number one beauty should be stunning. It had to be so beautiful that it could shake the heavens and shake the earth. It had to be so flamboyant and reckless that it could explode the plains. She had no attack power, no beauty, and had the appearance of a pitiful little wife. What was the number one beauty? Could it be discounted just because it was a side reward? No, this was simply not the right thing to do. Wei Wei Bai said to the system, I can't even look better than a corpse. How can I be considered the number one beauty? That Shaya's corpse was better looking than hers. Look at him, then look at herself. He was the Tmall seller show, she was the village version? The system was silent for a long time, then said, the number one beauty refers to the most beautiful of all women, men are not included. Otherwise she would be called the number one beauty. Not a beauty. Wei Wei Bai, with this kind of appearance she can't be the best among girls. The system said earnestly, don't worry, I said I'll be the first, so I'll definitely be the first. Wei Wei Bai bitterly looked at the mirror and then at Shaya. He found that although the magic potion allowed the bones to grow flesh, but the corpse still wouldn't move. Could it be that there was a problem with the potion formula? However, since the favorability would decrease, it meant that he was still conscious. It was just that he couldn't move. Wei Wei Bai stood in place and thought for a while before slowly walking in front of the young man. She opened her eyes wide and tried to observe him. The youth's grayish-purple eyes were abnormally still and lifeless. There was not the slightest fluctuation. But in Shaya's eyes, he saw her soft and sweet eyes rippling with a clear light. There was only curiosity and pure naivety. He already knew what she was giving him. When he lost consciousness, he was probably mistaken for a corpse and was brought back to be made into a witch servant. Unfortunately, the magic potion had no effect on him. Therefore she was puzzled as to why it was useless. Shaya calmly thought that after he digested the power of the dragon race, he would capture this presumptuous witch and burn her to death. Suddenly he felt something. The church's light power appeared. The little witch who was observing him opened her eyes wide in shock and then started to walk around in circles. What should I do? If I'm caught, I'll be burned to death. Chapter 2488. Shaya. All witches should be burned to death. Accept your fate. She was reminded by the system that there were people from the Church of Light searching for Wei Wei Bai in this area. She immediately searched her memory about the original owner of the body. There was a magic wardrobe here. After entering, it could hide 70% to 80% of the black magic aura. Wei Wei Bai immediately ran to open the wardrobe. It was okay, 2 people could squeeze in. After all, Shaya was also restored by black magic, so he would definitely be found. When Shaya saw the little witch, he hurriedly ran away. A faint understanding appeared in his eyes. Running for her life? Just when he thought that the little witch had escaped by herself. The little witch in the inappropriate robe hurriedly ran over again. Then she reached out and hugged him. He was much taller than her. She used all her strength but could barely drag him, step by step. The little witch's breathing was messy and heavy. With every step, her hands and feet trembled violently. He was worried that he would crush her. Her aura did not have the stench of black magic. Instead, it was a kind of rose fragrance. It was exceptionally alluring. Xiaya liked roses the most. So when he was promoted to Grand Duke, he bought 80% of the rose varieties in the country. He planted them in the garden. And it was also at that time that his nickname changed from the cold-hearted Terminator of Evil to the Rose Duke. Wei Bai stuffed Xiaya into the wardrobe. The delicate young man's eyes were half closed as he lay limply in the clothes. His honey-colored hair fell under his eyes. His grayish-purple eyes were still hazy like rain. Wei Bai felt that the system must have given him the #1 beauty medal. This was the #1 beauty she wanted, not the cute girl next door. Even if she was the cutest girl in the world, she was just cute. Was she not enough to act cute in the previous world? Was she going to continue acting cute in this world? Footsteps came from outside, and the aura of light was unusually strong. Wei Bai immediately squeezed into the wardrobe and closed it directly. She treated the young man behind her as a corpse and sat on his lap without thinking much. The wardrobe was too crowded. She closed the door and leaned back for comfort. Her thin and petite body nestled perfectly in the young man's arms. A slight heartbeat sounded in Wei Bai's ears. She raised her eyebrows. He was really alive. But was there not enough magic potions? Why didn't he move? He had consciousness, heartbeat, he was a living person. Wouldn't it be better if he didn't move? That way, no matter how she dealt with him, he wouldn't be able to escape. Just as Bai Weiwei was plotting to tempt the youth behind her, Xiaya's half-lowered line of sight just happened to fall into her loose robe, where half of her collarbone was faintly discernible. She seemed to be very scared. She suppressed her breathing and blew. He didn't feel. He had always hated anyone's body temperature. Because he found, this was the first time he actually felt that a person's aura was exceptionally pleasant to smell. #1 beauty medal, delicate, soft, easy to push. She had fair skin, a beautiful face, and a sweet aura. Most importantly, anyone who saw him would love him. Under the influence of the powerful medal, even the cold and cruel Rose Duke's heart trembled slightly. Ding, the male lead's favorability is -5. Wei Bai was expressionless. If it dropped, it dropped. If it rose, it rose. This time, the target let her smell the scent of a capricious ghost. Outside the door, 2 figures wearing white robes appeared. The white robes were embroidered with the church's golden border. One of them bowed his head respectfully and was about to say something. The taller figure suddenly bowed his head towards the room. Then, without saying anything, he turned around and left. The follower behind him followed with a puzzled face. After walking for a long time, the follower asked, "Lord Bishop, the room is obviously filled with the aura of black magic. Why didn't you search?" The bishop stopped. "There is the aura of that lord's light magic." The follower paused and suddenly revealed a look of shock. Then he lowered his head in fear and didn't dare to ask again. To facilitate your next reading, you can click on, Chapter 2489. The bishop reached out and pressed the magic bracelet. There was a hint of awe in his cold eyes under the hood. "Although I don't know why that lord would appear in a room with the aura of black magic, this is not something we can ask." The follower immediately said, "Yes, I understand." The bishop said, "When we go back, report the situation to the Pope. Before we get further instructions, no one is to disturb that place." He took a few steps forward. The bishop frowned and felt unsafe. "No, don't disturb the area around that house. That lord didn't just cultivate light magic. If someone else touched black magic, it might violate the taboo of the Church of Light. But if it was that lord, then everything had to make way for him. After all, even the Church of Light was built by his family. Even the current pope was a subordinate of the Rose family." Wei Bai hid in the cupboard. Because it was a little long, she couldn't bear the boredom. She began to yawn. Then she leaned against Xiaya's body and rubbed against his chest like an obedient kitten. She was extremely obedient and curled up in his warm embrace. She closed her eyes and seemed to be asleep. The beautiful and exquisite youth was like a puppet, motionless. But his grayish-purple eyes were calmly half-closed, staring deeply at the audacious Wei Bai. Although he didn't reject her aura, it didn't mean that he liked to be touched like this. He thought of a fanatical lunatic in the past. To touch him, she even risked her life. Although she only touched the corner of his clothes, she was hid away by his magic. But it still disgusted him enough. In the future, he wouldn't even wear clothes like this. If he was in his normal state, this little witch would dare to touch him. It was faster to dream. The Duke of Rose's cold eyes were filled with cold ridicule. When the people of the Church of Light broke into this house, They would capture the little witch. Bringing her back to the Church of Light and drinking the Pope's holy water would probably speed up the refinement of the dragon race's power. At that time he would personally go to the prison cell and beat this licentious and shameless little witch to death. In the end, as he waited, he already smelled the familiar aura of light magic. It was at least the aura of a bishop. That's great, he must know him. The aura of black magic in this room was so obvious that the bishop would definitely be able to tell. Then he left? Shaya was silent. He actually left just like that. As a bishop, he couldn't even see through a room of black magic. Could it be that he was too lax in his assessment? Or was he too brazen in using underhanded means? The little witch didn't seem to know that the people outside had left. She even curled up in his arms, trembling with fear as if she was trying to get some protection. If she wasn't asleep, that's what he convinced himself. She actually fell asleep at such a dangerous time? Shaya's eyes were even colder, cold like a purple gem, circulating with a breathtaking brilliance. He was actually hiding in a shabby and cheap wardrobe. He lay there like a corpse, holding a witch in his arms, unable to move. This was definitely the most embarrassing moment of his life. Just as Shaya's impression of this place dropped further, and his favorability was about to drop again, a soft sobbing sound, like the murmur of a kitten, sounded softly in front of his chest. Shaya couldn't move his gaze. He only felt that this soft and weak cry tickled his ears. Why are you crying? Are you that scared? I've never seen such a weak, cowardly, and harmless witch. For convenience next time, you can click on the button below to record this reading record. Chapter 2490. Thinking of the hundreds of witches he killed, all of them were evil and crazy. How could there be such a pitiful little witch? She was actually afraid of being caught and burned to death. He thought that witches were a group of lunatics who refined black magic and treated accepting their fate as a straw. After all, lunatics were not afraid of death. Even if they died, they would drag everyone down with them. Shaya listened to the little kitten-like crying, gently ringing. The moist temperature soaked through his clothes. It seemed to soak through the tip of his cold heart. In his cold eyes, there was finally a trace of helplessness. The people of the church had left. What was there to be afraid of, really? Too weak. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 0. Wei Bai, because this body was tired, waiting was too boring, so she fell asleep directly. In her sleep, she hugged her head and howled miserably, crying bitterly. Why is the number one beauty so ugly, giving me hope and making me despair? A corpse is prettier than me. Do I still have the face to go out? I want to change my face for plastic surgery. The system watched the favorability turn to 0, and then looked at the host, who did not forget the strategy in her sleep. Really dedicated. She could still pretend to be pitiful in her sleep, too admirable. Wei Bai woke up, feeling nothing about the favorability turning to 0. The headstrong ghost's corpse, the favorability increased inexplicably. It was normal after all, so many perverts, so many brainless targets. She was already calm about this kind of strategy target. She was not a newcomer to strategy, she was an old fox. What was the point of being surprised? Just muddle along. She was still waiting to muddle through one plane and return to the real world to increase her life points to 80 years. As for the 30 life points from the plane reward, forget about it. It was more than that. So every time she woke up in the real world, even the system was too lazy to calculate how much life points she got. How much life points were deducted. Anyway, the big head was not here. Of the plane rewards, only the side rewards could barely be used. No, it was not useful now. Whether it was the cute seller last time or the number one beauty this time. It made her feel the deep malice and stinginess of the autonomous system. Wei Bai dragged Shaya out of the wardrobe with great effort and put him back on the chair. His long legs were casually placed under the chair, and his honey-colored hair curled around his cheeks. He didn't close his eyes, but he couldn't really raise them either. Her clothes were a little messy and she looked like she had been ravaged. Wei Bai rubbed her nose to make sure she didn't have a nosebleed. Then she turned her back on him and paced calmly. How was he going to attack a corpse, and a corpse with consciousness at that? There was a problem with the magic potion, so he could not move. Actually, this wasn't a big deal. After all, it was fine as long as he was conscious. If he could move, she was worried that he would run away. After all, it seemed like there was a problem with the magic potion. As a result, he did not feel that he was the witch's servant at all. The failure of a potion recipe had many repercussions. For example, if a person was resurrected but was disobedient and ran away. Or he could stab the witch to death. Wei Bai felt that this corpse's favorability was probably from the time he stabbed the witch to death. It was better not to move. But this was her thinking. The original owner's character setting had to be maintained. For example, revenge or hatred with the Holy Church. Anyway, she had to pretend to be pitiful. In addition to her current appearance, she was a delicate and pitiful girl. Pretending to be pitiful was the most believable appearance. Chapter 2491. Moreover, she was very familiar with the skill of pretending to be pitiful. She was simply a skilled technician. She didn't even need to think. She could just pretend and be pitiful. Bai Weiwei calmly finalized the issue of her character, as well as the route of the follow-up strategy. As for whether he was from the Church of Light in his previous life, this wasn't important because he would lose his memory when he was resurrected. Right, amnesia. Weiwei Bai's eyes lit up. Amnesia was good. She was also very familiar with amnesia. Weiwei Bai felt that this plane was absolutely stable. Wasn't he in a state of amnesia? Then she could just fill in the blanks in his memory. For example, he loved her so much that it moved the heavens and earth. Weiwei Bai secretly clenched her fists and silently exclaimed. She had already seen countless favorability hugging her. She adjusted her state and reached out to pull at her face. Her eyes twitched a few times. Then she turned her head and trotted over to stretch out her hands. Xiaya lowered his eyes and was still secretly competing with the power of the dragon race. Suddenly he heard hurried footsteps. In his line of sight, he saw the little witch open her hands and pounce over, hugging his neck. Then she sat directly on his lap. With tears in her eyes, her slender fingers lifted his chin. The youth's beautiful face was raised. But her face didn't leave. This was the advantage of having a small face. Even at this distance it was cute. Bai Weiwei's tears dripped down her cheeks. Xiaya, I love you. Even if you become a corpse for me, I will give up everything to resurrect you. Xiaya. What the hell? Who became a corpse for you? No, how did she know his name? Weiwei Bai cried sadly. We used to be so in love, but that bastard Church of Light wanted to kill our witch. You rebelled against the Church of Light just to save me. I'm sorry. Xiaya. What the hell? Who rebelled against the Church of Light? When did this happen? Why didn't he know? Bai Weiwei wept, heartbroken, and kissed his lips. Xiaya continued to be in a daze. Weiwei Bai's eyes were red, and there were traces of tears on her delicate face. Her amber eyes reflected the face of a beautiful young man. It was as if he was really her one and only. They were lovers in love. Damn it. If it weren't for the fact that he couldn't move, he would have strangled her to death. A deep storm appeared in Xiaya's grayish-purple eyes. He stared at Weiwei Bai's face. A lovely girl, sitting on his lap, her beautiful face was like the sweetest candy. The way she looked when she was crying was breathtakingly beautiful. The more he looked at him, the more, he couldn't bring himself to hate him. Weiwei Bai rubbed her eyes. The corners of her eyes were red, and there was a charming seduction in her purity. Her eyelashes trembled and her eyes were filled with love. Xiaya suddenly thought of those disgusting zealots of his. Could it be that this little witch was actually one of his fanatical admirers? That was why he used a magic potion to revive him after picking him up. Just to satisfy her perverted love? He hated fanatical admirers the most. He hated it the most. Once again Xiaya was in a daze. That's why these admirers are really disgusting. Transmigration system. Adonis, come here. Crossover system. Adonis, come here and read the full article at https://www.sashu.com. Download Transmigration system. Adonis, come here and read this on your phone. https://m. sashu.com//. Chapter 2492. Weiwei Bai wanted to show that they were real lovers. She was worried that he would notice something was wrong, so she tried her best to create the atmosphere of a passionate love between the two of them. But he couldn't move now. Other than kissing him, he couldn't do anything else. So she kissed him with all her might. It would be a waste not to kiss him. Xiaya's mind went from being muddled to feeling disgusted to numb. As expected of a witch, she was evil. So shameless, still so shameless. A faint blush suddenly appeared on the beautiful boy's pale face. It was like a pink rose growing in the snow. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased by 2. Weiwei Bai. It seemed that he was not only a willful person but also a stingy person. 2 points, 2 points, 2 points. Don't you feel embarrassed? Weiwei Bai sat in Xiaya's arms and made up some stories about their love. She said that he chased her back then. He bought her a lot of jewelry with all his money. Xiaya, Weiwei Bai, and for me you went to 3 towns to buy honey cakes for me. Xiaya, Weiwei Bai, for me you didn't even look at princesses, dukes and daughters. Xiaya, he didn't look at them but it had nothing to do with her. Wei Wei Bai, and you would play the piano and sing love songs for me in the middle of the night. Xiao. Wei Wei Bai shyly held her face. In the end I still agreed to your proposal. Rose Duke, who only knew how to kick women away when he saw them. Who proposed? Was he the kind of person who would propose? Ridiculous. The little witch chattered for a long time. Xiao felt that he was about to fall asleep. A kiss gently landed on his forehead. The girl's voice was sweet, gentle, and soft. Xiao, although I know you can't hear me, I was still worried that you would be bored if you couldn't move, so I had to say more to you. Under Xiao's eyelashes, his cold purple eyes contained a hint of coldness. But because of this sentence he trembled. In his line of sight, the little witch's face was soft and clean under her reddened eyes. What was even cleaner was her sweet smile that was the same color as her eyes. It was like honey. Even though the words he said were all nonsense and preposterous. However, there was no smell of blood, nor was there any aura of black magic. Other than feeding him the resurrection magic potion, he did not do anything else. Even if she was a witch, she would be too clumsy to know anything. She didn't know magic, she didn't know how to dodge, and she definitely wasn't an evil little witch. Wei Wei Bai said a lot of sweet nothings. There were also many fictional stories. She tried her best to make Xiao think that they were lovers. It was natural that her favorability towards him didn't increase much. After all, a person with amnesia didn't mean that they were mentally retarded. During dinner, Wei Wei Bai boiled some meat soup and fed it to the boy. After all, they had to maintain the image of lovers. She had to treat him better. Otherwise he would doubt her words even more. It didn't matter that Xiao didn't need to eat. The magic energy in his body could maintain the state of his body. But when the little witch carefully blew on the meat soup and then fed him little by little with a small spoon, he actually didn't spit it out. Not being able to move didn't mean that he couldn't reject food. He still had this kind of physical instinct. The little witch chuckled and muttered, "There's no food at home again. I'll make more herbs to sell tomorrow. I won't let you starve." Xiao stared at the smile on her face, his eyes deep. After dinner, Wei Wei Bai took out hot water and gently wiped Xiao's face, hands, and feet. He had just grown out and was clean. Bathing would wait until tomorrow. This was the first time that Xiao was served so rudely. His face was red from being wiped. Because the weather was cold and it was snowing at night. Wei Wei Bai lit the fire and dragged Xiao's chair to the side of the fire. Worried that he was cold, she even squatted in front of him and held his hands with her hands. "When I sell the herbs and have money, I'll buy gloves for you." Xiao's body was still in severe pain. After all, the conflict and digestion of power was not easy. He had always been used to enduring and was also used to silently digesting in the dark. In the past, if someone dared to disturb him when he was digesting power, he had the heart to kill. The little witch pressed his cold fingers to her face and revealed a sweet smile. She said, "You won't be cold like this, Xiao." Fanatical, humble, and pitiful. Xiao coldly sneered in his heart. Admiring him so much. Really, annoying. Ding, the male lead's favorability is 7. Chapter 2493. Wei Wei Bai said that she was poor and she was really poor. To make witches slaves, she did everything she could. All the precious things that could be returned were exchanged for gold coins and then thrown to Xiao. Wei Wei Bai flipped through the formula again and again. It was impossible for a dead person to have memories after being resurrected by herbs. Because the effect of magic medicine was limited. Creating a complete soul was the domain of God. It was not the ability of witches. In this world, if a person wanted to be resurrected, all kinds of methods had sequelae. The witch's magic medicine was already one of the best methods of resurrection. But this kind of resurrection was at the cost of depriving the dead of all consciousness when they were alive. That was, once the witch's slave woke up, his mind would be blank. But his personality would have a high chance of being preserved. This was also the reason why witches' slaves would sometimes kill witches. Because some people, even if they lost their memories, their personalities were still so violent. Even if they lost their memories, they would not wait for others. Of course, they would clash with witches, but it was more because witches were too cruel. It led to the slaves' counterattack. All witches would have many restrictions and contracts to restrain their slaves. There was a drug in the magic medicine. This drug damaged the slave's brain and made him obedient. The effect was unknown. Anyway, Wei Wei Bai looked at the formula and a bunch of cases. Then he stealthily observed his servant. The exquisite young man was more attractive than the most gorgeous rose. Just like the most expensive doll made by a supermaster, which could only be called a work of art. But it was also a doll. It could not move. And the favorability was so up and down. Maybe his brain was really a little damaged? Wei Wei Bai felt that the goal of this plane was to conquer. It was a little miserable. Even if Xiaya could move and had a damaged brain, he could only go to the streets to beg. Xiaya, who was silently digesting the power and unable to move, suddenly felt a chill on his back. It felt like someone was cursing him. Wei Wei Bai struggled to use the data given by the system and carefully mixed the herbs. It was beautifying. She always believed that beautifying things were the most popular. Women as young as 7 years old and as old as 1 foot in the grave all loved beauty. Although it could only improve one's skin, it could also be modified with herbs. Especially for a newbie like her. If he used too much strength, the herbs would be destroyed. Fortunately, the materials were the cheapest. 1 iron coin could buy 10 sets of materials. He had to destroy at least 7 or 8 sets of materials before he could retrieve 1 set. Wei Wei Bai looked at the green liquid and felt that it was especially green. She put down the portion that she had finished with great difficulty and looked up to see Xiaya sitting quietly on the chair. He wondered if his butt would rot if he sat like this. Wei Wei Bai saw light coming from the window. She ran over, her petite body dragging the chair with great effort. Step by step, he dragged him to the window where there was light. Xiaya had been watching the little witch coldly from the sidelines, watching how she made the herbs. Although the materials were not poisonous. But the witch's formula was particularly strange. In their hands, good materials could turn into something like a plague even if they weren't poisonous. She was still a witch. Was he using poison to harm others? At first, Xiaya looked on coldly and then, forget it even if it was poison. With the little witch's crappy modulation method, it was estimated that she wouldn't succeed until the end of time. The more vicious the thing, the more difficult it was to make. Her fingers were shaking so badly when she put the materials in. Chapter 2494. She's worse than an ordinary person. How did she become a witch? Xiaya's eyes were half closed, his eyes cold and beautiful. Then, in his line of sight, the little witch suddenly ran over again. Is she going to kiss him again? In the end, she actually ran behind him. So it's not. A trace of strangeness appeared in Xiaya's heart. What was he expecting? Why was he thinking about whether she would kiss him or not? Suddenly his chair moved. He was dragged bit by bit, rubbing against the floor behind him, making a creaking sound. The little witch's soft gasps were very obvious. What is she going to do? Before Xiaya could be puzzled, the warm sun had already fallen on him. Wei Wei Bai put him in a place where there was light. After all, it was winter now. The winter here was particularly cold. The kind of cold when it snowed heavily. She was also poor and didn't have much money to buy firewood. That little bit of firewood would be used at night. Although this plane was very simple, it was also particularly bitter. Wei Wei Bai felt that she was going to become a little girl selling matches. It was almost time. After all, she was about to go to the streets and sell things. Compared to matches, the beautifying skincare water was definitely more popular. Wei Wei Bai was thinking about how to make money while unconsciously taking care of Xiaya. The target of the strategy was amnesia, brain problems and vegetative state. Her strategy was to take care of him, kiss him and brainwash him that they were lovers. The favorability rose to 7 and stopped moving. Wei Wei Bai reckoned that there wasn't enough time. She waited for the two of them to waste too much time. Even if Xiaya was suspicious, the two of them were not lovers now. She just had to pretend that she didn't know that he was awake and still take care of him and love him. He could only see her. After a long time he couldn't not love her. So Wei Wei Bai looked at him with a smile and adjusted his sitting position. She also covered his thighs with the only woolen blanket. When she was seriously pressing the woolen blanket for him, her big brown braids fell below her shoulders, and the braids were tied with a simple hair band. There was not a single flower or a little decoration. Even the poorest girl always had some cheap decorations in her hair. Not to mention aristocratic families. Nowadays the style of banquets in the upper class was all luxurious. Those women were too embarrassed to go out without jewelry and flowers on their heads. The little witch carefully adjusted her position so that he could get the best sunlight. Then she went to get a woman's scarf, which was bright red. Xiaya felt warm all over. Actually, he didn't need it and he didn't feel cold. When the little witch wrapped the scarf around his neck, her fingers touched his neck. That trace of coolness swept across his skin. She was very cold. Moreover, he was always wearing a shabby robe with only a simple inner shirt underneath. In this kind of weather, it was lucky that she didn't get sick from wearing such clothes. After Wei Wei Bai was done, she couldn't help blowing on her fingers. Her fresh and tender fingers were all red from the cold. Her tender white skin was also red from the cold. Just like sweet cherries. It had even been frozen. Xiaya's face was expressionless as his grayish-purple eyes stared fixedly at her. The little witch jumped, and the end of her whip moved with her. Then she thought of something and turned to him with a smile. Shaya, after I make the herbs I can sell them for money. Then I'll buy you new clothes. Shaya, I don't want the money from selling witches' poison. Then he heard the little witch muttering to herself, these herbs are not poisonous and they can also protect the skin. Women like them. Chapter 2495. Shaya, no, I definitely can't sell it. If I sell this kind of thing I'll be targeted by the patrol. Moreover, the skincare products are already full. Even the poor have the habit of buying them in small shops. So if she didn't have a special channel, she would rely on selling things on the streets. Not only would she not be able to sell it, she might even be arrested and locked up in prison. And a prison cell was a hellish existence for a girl. After the little witch finished talking to herself, she said energetically, then I'll go make the potion. You can bask in the sun first. When I'm done I'll tell you a story. She was afraid that the vegetable would be bored. She used all her patience and thoughtfulness to ensure that he would be obedient. Compared to the other planes that were either dead or alive. Other than being a nanny, this plane was simply heaven. Shaya sat on the chair, extremely quiet. Previously, he could see the little witch in his line of sight. But after she changed her position, he could only see the sunlight outside the window. At first he didn't feel anything. After all, he could still hear the little witch's footsteps running around. There was also the sound of materials being destroyed. Occasionally he could see a corner of her tattered robe. So he still felt lively. However, that sound slowly disappeared. First, the sound of footsteps disappeared. The little witch should be sitting at the table, trying her best to make the unsellable beautifying potion with her clumsy technique. So she stopped walking. But the sound of making the potion slowly stopped. There was no sound. In the empty room there was one less person's voice. It was actually so quiet. Shaya sat indifferently as if he didn't care. In the past he could stay in the barren land alone for a year without feeling anything. In the barren land except for the occasional storm. Basically there were no creatures and no sound. That place drove many people crazy. But he felt very good. He never liked excitement. It was better for the little witch to be silent. He liked silence the most. The sun gradually disappeared and it was dark. There were no candles lit in the room. The black room was even colder. Shouldn't the little witch come over and push a chair for him? After all, there was no sunlight. Moreover, no matter how frugal she was, she knew to light an oil lamp when it was dark. The Rose Duke, who was never afraid of the dark and restless, looked coldly at the window. Nothing bad will happen, right? After all, it was not unheard of for people to be poisoned to death while making potions. At this thought, Shaya's eyelashes fluttered, and his eyes regained their strength. His lazy eyelids finally opened bit by bit. At this moment, his hazy grayish-purple eyes were dyed with a stunning radiance. It was clear and cold, replacing the hazy death aura. Her long eyelashes fluttered upward like the wings of a butterfly. The power of the dragon clan was still clashing with his power. But he had digested some of it, and at least he had the strength to move his eyes. Shaya struggled to move his eyes and found that if he didn't turn his head, his vision was limited. He could only see the corner of the shabby table. There was no sign of the little witch. A slight change of expression appeared on Shaya's excessively exquisite face. This was not easy for him. Every time he moved, he would drain his limited magic power. He pursed his lips with difficulty and moved his fingers. As if he was testing the waters, he suppressed the power of the dragon race and used some of his own power. Intense pain invaded his bones. It made his muscles tremble a little. Shaya took a slow breath, and a small sweat appeared on his forehead. His honey-colored hair stuck to his forehead, and his fair face was flushed with fatigue. Chapter 2496. In the darkness, the young man finally got up slowly. His beautiful fingertips unhurriedly caught the blanket that had slipped from his knees. The worn blanket was thick, but one could see that it had been there for a long time. Shaya's cold and delicate face, even if he endured severe pain, did not change a bit. He had the noble's reservedness and forbearance, even if he suffered great pain. He also had to maintain an elegant posture. Shaya slowly got up and finally turned around. Some of the scattered hair on his forehead fell under his eyes. He did not waste his energy to comb his hair, but looked at the table through the gaps in his hair. On the long mahogany table, there were all kinds of messy materials. In the middle of the table, a small figure was lying on her stomach. The wide robe slipped off her shoulders. The female's underwear was thin, and the white thin shirt was a bit big. When the girl was lying on her stomach, some of the messy braids fell on her thin back. Because of his posture, his extremely fragile neck was exposed as well as the weak lines of his shoulders. In the darkness, the young man stared at her expressionlessly, as if to see if she was pretending to be asleep. He supported the back of the chair with one hand. It could be seen that his posture was strained, but his back was still straight, making his figure more slender and pleasing to the eye. He seemed to be gathering strength. He waited for a while. Then slowly, step by step, he walked over. When he came to the table, he reluctantly raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Snap. The room suddenly lit up. It was not an oil lamp nor a candle. It was light magic. Shaya used a little bit of magic and his breath was a bit uneven. However, his snow-white face was still so cold that not a single trace of emotion could be seen. The little witch was lying on her stomach, and half of her face that was not covered by her arms appeared in the light. Her delicate eyebrows were tightly knitted, and there were traces of haggard on her thin white face. Her lips were bright red but somewhat dry. These days she had been taking care of him. She never took care of herself. At night she would get up from time to time and tuck in the quilt for him. She was worried that there would be a gap in his quilt and he would be blown by the cold wind. Shaya stood quietly in front of the table, his eyes still cold. He thought for a while, then stretched out his hand and his slender fingers fell on her neck. With just a little strength he could break her neck. Killing witches was his mission as well as his habit. But when his fingertips touched her skin, he realized how cold she was. It was so cold that it felt like a corpse. Shaya's fingertips trembled and he suddenly retracted them. His movements were too big and his face paled. With both hands on the table he could barely stand. This time, taking the risk to go to the Dragon Clan's Holy Land could really be a mistake. He was still too young to control the power of the dragon race's holy dragon skeleton. It was too difficult. However, there were too many filthy matters in the family which also affected his interests. If he didn't quickly stand at the top of the Empire's power, in that case, it was still not certain who would obtain the authority of the clan. Shaya coldly spat out a name. If those who knew were here they would definitely be shocked. Because he had coldly called out the king's name in an unusually contemptuous tone. Shaya looked at the little witch, his purple eyes so cold that it made people tremble. If you're so poor, don't learn how to help others. They deserve to die of poverty, cold, and starvation. Shaya stretched out his hand again. His fair fingertips were like snow on a mountain peak, more exquisite and cold. His fingertips lightly fell on her hair. A few wisps of magic fell into her body. Her skin warmed up again, and the tight frown on her face eased a little. Shaya's pair of beautiful and clear purple eyes showed a trace of fluctuation. When Wei Wei Bai was woken up by the system, the room was dark. The delicate youth was still sitting quietly on the chair. The woolen blanket was still meticulously covering his legs. But the favorability had become 10. Mobile. Chapter 2497. Wei Wei Bai's first reaction was that her care had worked. He might even start to believe that the two of them were lovers. So the favorability climbed up. It didn't climb up, it just climbed up by 3 points. The system suddenly said, "Just now your doll got up." Wei Wei Bai asked, "He can move?" The system said, "Yes." He seemed to be forcing it. He walked a few steps and his kidneys were weak. "Then he walked in front of you," Wei Wei Bai chuckled. "Did he kiss me when he walked in front of me? Wasn't this the usual routine?" Although it was only 10 points, it was still a favorable impression. He kissed her secretly, then the favorability would secretly increase. The system said, "No, he walked in front of you and reached out to strangle your neck." In the end he gave up because he didn't have enough energy. "Wei Wei Bai," the system said, "I heard that witches are slaves. Sometimes they would kill witches and become masters themselves." "Wei Wei Bai," the system said, "If he could really move, would he chop you up?" "Wei Wei Bai," the system said, "So you don't have to work so hard. To be good to him or to poison him and make him stupid." It didn't finish its sentence. Wei Wei Bai, who always had a tacit understanding with the system, had already reacted. She immediately nodded, showing an extremely deep expression. "Okay, I got it." The system was relieved. After all, it watched the host rush the work of a caretaker every day. There was good food left for the male lead. He drank his own soup. There was a warm blanket for the male lead. He froze like a dog. He felt that it was better to change the target of the strategy. If this continued, the strategy would not be completed. He would probably die from malnutrition. If Yeshuan didn't insist on following. There was a problem with his data book, and he couldn't provide the host with detailed information for reference. He couldn't give the host any cheat. the host wouldn't be in such a bad state. If he knew, he wouldn't have bought the number 1 beauty. He should have bought the light immunity. After all, with the light immunity, the host would be able to get rid of the dark aura on the witch. To be able to avoid all kinds of detection by the Church of Light. In that case, he wouldn't have to scrimp on food when he went out to work. The system felt that the next time it saw something like the number 1 beauty, etc. I must never tell the host. Women are irrational for the sake of beauty. The world's strongest man and the world's most beautiful woman were in front of the host. The host would only choose the number 1 beauty. While the system was feeling heartache, Wei Bai was already happily running to light the oil lamp. Then he began to light the wood for the stove with difficulty. It took a lot of effort to warm up half of the house. Wei Bai lifted her overlong robe and lightly ran in front of Shaya. She reached out and gently cupped Shaya's face. Shaya's purple eyes turned gloomy. Only then did Wei Bai see clearly that he was indeed conscious. But usually he was too good at pretending. It was hard to tell. She pretended not to see anything. Worry appeared on her face. Her beautiful honey eyes were filled with heartache. Shaya, are you cold? Sorry I fell asleep and let you be in the wind. Shaya, her fingers were still cold. Although he gave her some magic to keep her warm, the time was limited. And he couldn't make it too obvious. If she woke up and noticed traces of light magic, she would probably be suspicious. So before she woke up, the magic disappeared and her skin was cold again. The button. Chapter 2498. Shaya was expressionless, not even the slightest expression or movement. But the girl didn't care whether she was cold or not. Her fingers were incomparably presumptuous as they touched his face. The girl's breath contained an icy aura, with a clean and cold fragrance. It was like a rose frozen in the snow. It was like a red cherry that was still in crushed ice. No matter what, it smelled good and it didn't arouse any disgust at all. Shaya was used to the extravagance of nobles since he was young, and he could smell all kinds of artificial perfumes. He couldn't say whether it was annoying or not, but he was used to it. But her breath made all the smells he had smelled in the past become disgusting and unbearable. The little witch didn't wear perfume. How could a person's body smell so perfect? Shaya didn't know what his mind was thinking. He had already thought of schemes: the dragon race, the holy dragon skeleton, the power transfer to the little witch is annoying, the little witch is very poor, the little witch's body fragrance, the little witch. Why were they all little witches? Had he been here for too long and been brainwashed by the little witch? If he didn't know that there was no trace of black magic on him, he would suspect that the little witch had drugged him. Her cold fingers moved down little by little, gently sliding down from his face. The coolness and the slightly warm temperature of his skin had a special reaction. A numb and unfamiliar touch gently rushed from his skin to his senses. Shaya could hardly control it. His long and thick eyelashes trembled, and his clear purple eyes had a trace of the same light. Just as her fingers were touching his neck, Lu Jinyan's lips parted. Her fingertips touched his collarbone but stopped. Wei Bai's eyebrows relaxed and she couldn't help but smile. You're not cold, your skin is still warm. In the flickering candlelight, the girl's smile was extremely pure. Shaya's gaze was frozen as he stared at her smiling face. The little witch didn't know that he was looking at her. She ran behind the chair and dragged it with effort, little by little dragging him towards the fire. Her slender arms had no strength. Her panting was so obvious. Even her footsteps were staggering. However, she never overturned the chair. Shaya lowered his eyes. His indifferent face was still like an exquisite sculpture. In the light and shadow there was a kind of lifeless beauty. He didn't seem to care about her at all. Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 15. Wei Bai was dragging a chair. The system exasperatedly said, "Wow, this guy wants to kill you. You should break his brain instead of continuing to be nice to him." Wei Bai chuckled. "I'm such a kind and beautiful number 1 beauty. How could I do such a bad thing? Am I the kind of person who would make a target stupid just for favorability?" Bai Weiwei was resolute. "I'm not." Stop praising yourself. If you keep praising yourself, I'm going to throw up. Wei Bai, if his brain isn't working well, his favorability would be unstable. It's fine as long as his brain is clear. Besides, we don't have any deep hatred for each other. It was just a moment of impulse to kill him. There were so many people who wanted to kill her. She was used to dealing with them. Moreover, many of the targets really did have deep hatred for each other. But this time Shaya was much simpler. His mind was blank. Perhaps his personality was very cautious when he was alive, so even if he lost his memory he was still very careful. He didn't believe her words. // Chapter 2499. But he had no other way to get his memories. He could only observe her every day. She just had to act harmless and be nice to him. She didn't believe that the target of this strategy would not be moved. Just as she was thinking, she heard that the favorability level had increased to 15. Wei Bai narrowed her eyes. She was very calm, but she was not very proud. After all, this was all part of her plan, so it was natural that she would get the result. She dragged Shaya to the stove and began to heat up some vegetable soup and toast some hot bread. Then she fed him little by little. Shaya could eat, and he didn't have the problem of not swallowing things in his mouth. She pinched the bread into small pieces and gently touched his lips, then pressed it in with a little force. Her delicate fingertips lightly brushed against his thin lips, still carrying a hint of coldness. She carefully held the plate and used a spoon to spoon the vegetable soup seriously. Some meat was added to the vegetable soup. These meat were specially picked out by her and made for him to eat. Shaya stared at her coldly. His eyes didn't move much, but the sense of scrutiny was very strong. At first he suspected that she had a motive. After so many days together, he was sure that she really had no motive. Even when she wiped his body, she was meticulous and serious. But when she was done, her ears would always be unbelievably red. His face was also flushed red from the rush of blood. Although she came to kiss him presumptuously, she had never really used a profane method. She cherished it very much. It was as if a kiss could make her feel happy even if she was hungry or cold. What kind of mood was this? This was the first time Shaya came into contact with this kind of person. He didn't understand. But the little witch was harmless, which caused him to not have the initial intention to kill her. Shaya originally wanted to contact the people from the church. But the church's spy had not been caught. In his current situation, it was not suitable for him to appear immediately. After all, if he wanted to kill him, now was the best time. So Shaya didn't move and continued to be a statue. After feeding Shaya, she wiped his mouth. The thin skin of her fingertips rubbed against the beautiful lines of the young man's thin lips. It was like a casual touch, but it brought a slight numbness. Wei Bai calmly lowered her eyes, retracted her fingers, and then cleaned up the tableware. She herself had only eaten half a piece of bread, and her thin body was pitifully frail in her loose robe. When she held the plate and turned to wash it, the eyelashes of the youth on the chair, which were the same color as his hair, slowly moved. Then the grayish-purple eyes moved. It was a little difficult, but it was no longer like before where it could only freeze. His eyes followed her back as she walked away. He watched her walk out. There was a very simple kitchen here, and the food inside was very varied. Shaya felt that the pauper should be able to get enough food. If she had not been a witch, she would have been able to go to the Church of Light on Sundays and receive alms. If it was the bishop's birthday, he might even get some meat or a bag of potatoes. How could a witch be in such a miserable state? It also proved that she didn't harm anyone. This was because most of the witch's wealth came from harming people, poisoning people, and curses. Shaya looked at her disappearing figure. Only then did he lower his beautiful eyes unhurriedly. His pale face was cold and indifferent. Only his thin lips were red and bewitching. He suddenly got up gently as if he had slowed down a few beats and moved to the side of the table. He looked at the leftover materials on the table. Chapter 2500. He gently reached out and infused some of the magic he had just accumulated. Then Shaya sat back on the chair. He thought coldly, the little witch didn't kill anyone, so he couldn't be bothered to kill her. After all, it takes energy to kill. She's not worth it. The magic just now, I'll just treat it as a reward for dinner. In the future, don't think that I'll repay her for taking care of me these days. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 20. Wei Bai was sitting on a stool in the small kitchen, eating a meat bun in her hand. Although the family was poor, they still had money to buy food. However, being poor was also a means of conquering. If a person only had one bun and gave you 2/3, you would feel very touched. If a person had 100 pieces of bread and gave you 3, you would think that he was stingy. So to let Shaya know that it wasn't easy for her, she deliberately showed that there was not enough food at home. But even if she starved herself to death, she would definitely let him eat his fill. Was he touched? Look, 20 favorability. He must be touched. Wei Bai didn't dare to make a sound, but she still couldn't help but laugh. Then she finished the meat bun and drank a few mouthfuls of vegetable soup before washing up. Wei Bai, who was full, came out. She continued to make potions. The system had already told her that Shaya had just infused magic into the materials with difficulty. She asked the system strangely, "Do you still remember how to use magic after losing your memory?" System: "Of course, in terms of magic skills, witches will definitely keep them in their recipes. Otherwise, what's the use of having a servant who can't use magic?" Wei Wei Bai felt that it was right, it was logical and common sense. But why did he infuse magic into the materials? Wei Wei Bai was at a loss as she mixed the potions and found something amazing. All the potions were successfully mixed in one go. How could she just throw them around and succeed? This magic was too useful. Xiaya could only see the side of the little witch's face, and from her expression, he saw that she was at a loss, then shocked and finally happy. Her eyelashes were curled, and the joy in her eyes was exceptionally cute. Xiaya's thin lips moved and he couldn't help but curve, but he quickly suppressed it. Several of the lowest grade potions were successfully concocted. What's so funny? Back then he didn't think it was a big deal when he made the holy water of the highest grade. Wei Wei Bai neatly placed the potion and happily ran over. She held Xiaya's face with both hands and affectionately kissed him. Her eyes were filled with pure happiness as she smiled. "Xiaya, I'm so awesome. This is the first time I've successfully concocted a potion. We can go sell it tomorrow." A trace of disdain appeared in Xiaya's eyes. What was there to be happy about? The more powerful potions were just a small matter. Wei Wei Bai took the opportunity to sit on the young man's lap, smiling sweetly. "Once I've saved enough money, I'll hire a priest and we can get married." "Xiaya, get married?" Wei Wei Bai gently wrapped her arms around his neck. Her light yellow eyes were incomparably clear, and they were filled with undisguised love. "Back then you said you would marry me, but what I waited for was the news of your death." The tears in her eyes slowly filled her eyes. The girl cried silently, her lips tightly pursed. She hurriedly wiped her tears, but there were tears in the gaps between her fingers. The girl's voice was choked with sobs and there was a forced smile. "I won't let you leave in the future. Even if the whole world stops us, I will be with you." Wei Wei Bai buried her face in his arms, trembling non-stop. And Xiaya, it was obviously fake, but she couldn't hide her feelings. There was also grief in his heart. It was also real. Could it be that he really had amnesia? Forgot about her? Or did she recognize the wrong person? Download the https://www.sashu.com/ download the full article. https://www.sashu.com download the full article. https://www.sashu.com download the full article. https://m.sashu.com. Chapter 2501. Wei Wei Bai, who was nestled in his arms, kept muttering. Why didn't the favorability increase? Did her acting skills deteriorate? Wei Wei Bai, who acted as an infatuated girl, made people suspect that she had amnesia. She didn't expect that the original owner of the body picked up a skeleton. Was a real person. The magic potion didn't have any effect. The brain had nothing to do with memory. But her grief succeeded in making this noble youth, who had always been calm and gloomy, doubt his brain for the first time. Wei Wei Bai waited and waited until she fell asleep, but she didn't see the favorability increase. This cold-hearted and heartless ghost. A normal person who had amnesia, even if their mind was blank. But at least there was sympathy. And people were very tolerant of people who loved them. Even if they didn't like them, they wouldn't hate them. Before he was sure of his memory, he saw that she was going to fight against the whole world for him. Shouldn't he show some appreciation? Wei Wei Bai, while sleeping, made a moral condemnation of the target's character. In the quiet room there were all kinds of messy tables and chairs. Dried flowers hung on the walls, and the fire in the fireplace occasionally crackled. If it was in the past, this kind of place. Xiaya couldn't tolerate his feet stepping into it. He sat quietly, and under his light-colored eyelashes, his grayish-purple eyes were unusually beautiful. His skin was as cold as snow, and under the light, there was a soul-stirring sense of paleness of a sick noble. The Grand Duke of Rose. Not only because he liked Rose. It was also because Duke Xiaya's face was more exquisite and gorgeous than Rose. The Flower of the Empire was a title given to him in private by the most authoritative noble circle. Of course, there was another title, which was the Cold Arbiter. The aloof and chaste Duke had never shown mercy to any sinful and filthy things. Strict, cold, and emotionless. This made everyone in the Empire not dare to have a trace of covetousness towards him. Even if his appearance was too shockingly beautiful. Shaya's lowered gaze just happened to see her long and curly eyelashes. Because she was asleep, her eyelashes were quietly drooping. The delicate skin on her face was soft and tender under the dim yellow light. However, he still did not lose a single bit of color. She was as beautiful as the little angels in the court paintings. There was not a single trace of the witch's black on it. Even her brown hair was not dyed by black magic. Instead, this was his true nature. If it weren't for the witch's brand on her body. At first glance, he couldn't tell if she was a witch or not. Shaya was silent for a long time. The outline of the middle half of his face hidden in the shadows was surprisingly perfect. After an unknown amount of time, he finally moved. It was as if he was slowly breaking through the ice. His body also began to move slowly. First, his fingers trembled slightly. Then it was the arm. In the end, his slender fingers finally landed on the back of the girl in his arms. The thin back under his fingers made him frown. Then he slowly hooked his arm around her waist and let her fall into his arms. The girl's long braids were messy. She had been taking care of him the whole day, but she couldn't take care of herself. Shaya calmly looked at her face for a long time. His purple eyes were still so dark that no emotions could be seen. Then he stretched out his other hand and gently lifted her hair band with his fingertips. The rough band fell to the ground. Her long, thick and silky hair had already spread out. Chapter 2502. Shaya's fingers carelessly brushed through her brown hair. It was slightly astringent, probably because she didn't have enough money to use good hair care ointment. Shaya pursed his thin lips. She had been fiddling with some beautifying potion all day. She had forgotten to use some for herself. In the past few decades, the empire had become stronger and wealthier. All women chased after the luxurious style of the noble circle. No woman would look down on her own face and hair. He narrowed his eyes lazily and his fingertips came to her neck. Her breathing was still very steady. It seemed that she didn't have a trace of vigilance. How could she be so careless? As a witch, she lived in fear of being killed every day. No matter how weak a witch was, she would not be able to sleep well. Was she not afraid that she would be killed by the Church of Light in the middle of her sleep? Or was it because she had not been a witch for long? So she had not developed a sense of vigilance? Shaya thought of many possibilities, but suddenly found that her breathing had become a little heavier. Her face was also a little red. She seemed to be a little uncomfortable. His fingers were pressing on her, making it impossible for her to breathe. The youth's murderous, bloody hand trembled slightly. Then, as if he was afraid of crushing a piece of cake, he immediately let go. Wei Bai's face immediately improved, and then she naturally buried her face in his arms again. She seemed to have practiced this posture thousands of times. If she had never been hugged like this before, her instinctive reaction would not be so practiced. Who had hugged her like this before? Shaya stared at her silently for a long time. His eyes were still obscure and cold. Finally, he gathered his strength and with a force of his arm, he pulled her directly into his arms. Her soft face was even closer to his chest. Her petite body was much lighter than a bird. Her arms and legs were too slender and fragile, as if he could break them with a little strength. Was this caused by malnutrition? Shaya stared at her sleeping face. Maybe it was not because she was not vigilant. But because she was hungry and tired, that was why she slept so soundly. Shaya's mood was very complicated for a moment. He stood up with difficulty and deliberately weighed her. She was really too light. It was obvious that this shabby house had once been glorious. At the very least, he wouldn't be poor all the time. The wood of the floor and the fireplace, all of them required a large amount of gold coins. Although there was only one room, there was a kitchen, a bathroom, and a balcony. This was unimaginable in a truly poor family. Moreover, the house was quite old, so it shouldn't have been built by the little witch. It was an old and dilapidated house, but one could see that the furnishings were not bad. It must be her mother or some female relative, a witch. And it was that relative who had put the witch mark on her. Maybe it started when he was very young. However, the little witch's aura did not reek of blood, nor did she have any traces of black magic. Her hair and eyes also proved that she was barely able to reach the entry level of black magic. Shaya carefully observed in his heart and finally walked into the room. The room was not big and the bed was a single bed. He had been sleeping here all this time. The dry and warm bedding was specially dried by her. As for her, Shaya raised his eyes and looked at the recliner beside the bed. That was where she spent this period of time. Shaya's gaze stopped on the recliner for a long time before he finally slowly walked to the bedside. Chapter 2503. He put her on the bed and pulled the quilt over her. These few simple actions had already made him sweat profusely. On his sweaty skin, there were a few illusions of golden scales. This was the process of digesting the holy dragon skeleton. The girl on the bed was sleeping peacefully. Her light red lips had a kind of delicate beauty in the dark. Her thick hair was spread out, so beautiful that she didn't look like a real person. Xiaya quietly observed her for a while, then gently put his finger on her lips. The soft touch made his fingertips stiffen a little. Then he injected the magic power into her body. The magic could at least make her body better, otherwise she would have slept under the quilt for a whole night. Her hands and feet couldn't warm up. After the magic entered her body, her white cheeks blushed. Her skin wasn't cold anymore. Xiaya pursed his thin red lips, and an inconspicuous smile appeared. Just take it as returning her care. Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 25. Xiaya ignored the importance he attached to a witch, and didn't notice the faint pity in his heart. It made his heart beat faster. He had always been cold and strong, and never cared about the small fluctuations in his heart. Xiaya's footsteps were slow, and he continued to walk out of the room. Then he began to check the room. He wanted to make sure that the little witch didn't want to lie to him. After all, she misunderstood him and resurrected him as a corpse, and hugged him every day saying that she loved him. That was already the biggest lie of all. He didn't think that he had really lost his memory. So what was the little witch's purpose? Not long after Xiaya left, Wei Bai opened her eyes under the quilt. She had always been vigilant if she wasn't as tired as a dog. Usually, as long as there was any movement, she would wake up. At first, she did fall asleep, but when Xiaya put her on the bed, she was almost awake. She called, "System, has the house been cleaned up?" The system, cleaned up. Cleaned up referred to the original owner's things in the house. She had read a lot of books in the house and found that the dark aura of witches came from the soul. Every time she cursed a person, the soul would emit a stench. Only those who trained in light magic would be able to smell it. After she came, she replaced the original master's soul, so her soul didn't have the aura of darkness. This meant that she had not harmed anyone. A person who had not harmed anyone even if she was a witch. Then, for Xiaya who had lost his memory, it would definitely make him less vigilant. Cleaning up the house was to destroy some of the harmful things of the original owner. Then put in some masculine things. Because these things were too trivial, the system was worried that it would make a mistake. He bought a house model from the supermarket. As long as he entered the desired state of the house, he could immediately change the furnishings of the house and deal with things that did not conform to the model. There were also a few more logical gadgets. For example, the male clothes in the wardrobe. No matter if it was new or old, they all fit Xiaya. In some places that needed to be embroidered, the first letters of his name were embroidered. There were also small male things, some booklets with male handwriting or annotated books. Right, there should be books on light magic as well. After all, Xiaya was from the Church of Light. If Xiaya flipped the house like this, the more he would believe her words. Wei Bai stretched out her hand and pulled the quilt, then lay down on the bed and continued to close her eyes to rest. There shouldn't be any problems tonight. Chapter 2504. After all, Xiaya had started to move. Although she was a witch now, she didn't have any witch abilities. She also couldn't put any witch restrictions on him so that he couldn't run away. Just 20 favorability. If this man had an especially rebellious personality when he was alive. Even if he lost his memory, he wouldn't be willing to stay. If he wanted to run away, she didn't have the ability to stop him. Who asked her to be so bad? Wei Bai sighed. If I knew, I wouldn't have asked for the number 1 beauty. Light immunity would have been good. At least it was one of the magic talents. System, now you're regretting? But since the host was regretting, the system could only share her depression. Actually, you can take it back. The number 1 beauty can exchange for light immunity once. I'll exchange it for you now. There were some things in the supermarket that could be exchanged. Wei Bai immediately smiled. No need to go through so much trouble. How can I accept it? The kind angelic system revealed a sinister smile. It's no trouble. For you, I'll enjoy any trouble. I'll exchange it for you. Wei Bai, exchange and we'll break off ties. System, damn host, did she have his feelings? If she threatened to break off ties again, he would listen. Meanwhile, Xiaya had already slowly walked past some key areas. He also unhurriedly flipped through the books and took notes. At first, he didn't find anything harmful in the house. It was just some very basic witch's equipment, but they were all very cheap. The little witch should have inherited her relatives' things, but the important and expensive things were all taken away by the previous witch. She was left with these rubbish basic things. And it could be seen that she wasn't a qualified witch. Instead, she was a clumsy little girl who couldn't even be considered a witch. Because she didn't even know how to use these basic things, even the unbelievably simple beautifying water. She could fail 8 or 9 times out of 10. Any ordinary person with a little bit of talent could defeat her. Shaya stood by the table, leaning against the old mahogany table. His purple eyes coldly stared at the thing on the table. It was an old pocket watch. The Empire's mechanical engineers didn't get much attention. But aristocratic things like clocks or mechanical bird cages were very popular. This is a man's pocket watch. Shaya's incomparably cold and pale face became even more noble and exquisite because of his silence. He stood for a while, then reached out with his fingertips, casually picked up the chain that was beginning to fade and lifted the watch. Then his fingertips moved slightly and the pocket watch opened. The watch had lost its power. However, Shaya's eyes were fixed on the top of the pocket watch. It was an image. In such a small picture, the girl's smile was so beautiful that it was breathtaking. It was the little witch's. Shaya's expression turned cold, and a baleful aura began to emerge in his ice-cold eyes. This thing didn't seem to belong to the little witch's relatives. This was because the aura on it was the remnants of light magic. Furthermore, there was a beautiful letter, S, engraved on the inside of the embrace. Are they the initials of the owner's name? His initials were also S. But he knew that this thing was not his. Shaya expressionlessly threw the pocket watch back on the table and then continued to rummage through it. Then, like a chain reaction, he found more and more traces of men. And it was the same man. Some books of light magic that shouldn't be in a witch's house. They were very well preserved, and there were often annotations in a man's handwriting. It wasn't his handwriting. But it could be seen that it was a noble's slightly elegant grammar. Could this man be a noble? Learning light magic, noble, initials. He fit the description, but unfortunately the handwriting wasn't his. Shaya's fingers flipped through a page of notes. His fingers paused slightly. A line of unfamiliar male handwriting appeared. Wei Wei, my love, I am willing to give up everything to be with you. Chapter 2505. So this man wasn't her father, uncle, or anything like that. He was her lover. He thought that she was lying to him, but he didn't expect that. She really had a lover who loved her. And she treated him as a substitute for the man who wrote this line of words? Shaya's grayish-purple eyes stared at the line of words. He didn't know how long he stared at it, but he murmured and gritted his teeth. Wei Wei. Was that her name? It was quite cute. It was just that her eyes weren't good and she actually mistook him for her lover. If she knew that the man she used all her strength to revive was someone else, how desperate would that be? Thinking about it made him happy. Shaya raised his head and looked at a mirror that was casually placed on the ground. The mirror was gray, but he could see that the youth was wearing simple commoner clothes, which were fitting but shabby. But there was still a trace of the youth's noble temperament. Shaya's purple eyes were cold and incomparably cold. He stretched out his hand, and his slender fingertips casually tugged at the button of his collar, revealing his exquisite collarbone. The rose-colored youth's thin lips curled up slightly, and his smile was indescribably evil and gorgeous. You want me to be a substitute, but you don't know if you can pay the price. She wanted Rose Duchess, whose hands were stained with blood, to be her substitute puppet. But it was very expensive. He murmured softly and repeated softly, Wei Wei. The dreamy sigh was gorgeous and tactful. But it was unusually cold. Wei Wei waited for the favorability notification. She waited and waited until she fell asleep. There was no favorability notification. She once again confirmed that Shaya was a stingy and cold person. Even if she thought that the two of them were lovers before they lost their memories, he didn't feel guilty at all. Perhaps this skeleton's personality was particularly cold when he was alive. So no memories meant no feelings. Even if she believed that the two of them were lovers, it wouldn't increase the favorability. Because there was no favorability, she slept very bitterly. Her delicate brows were tightly knitted in her sleep. Her grievance was very obvious. The youth had almost used up his last bit of strength. He moved into the room with difficulty. He saw the girl in her sleep biting her beautiful lower lip and frowning. A trace of grievance appeared at the corner of his eyes. She seemed to be thinking about that damned man who was already dead and rotting? Shaya quietly and indifferently stared at her for a good while. Under his honey-colored curly hair, his pair of grayish-purple eyes were so cold that it was penetrating. How similar was he to that man? Why would she admit her mistake? A trace of doubt flashed through Shea's heart. But soon, because Wei Wei Bai was sleeping too happily, she turned over and actually flipped half of her body out of bed. If she moved a little more, she would fall off the simple single bed. This interruption made the doubts in his mind disappear. He took a few steps forward with an expressionless face. Then he gently reached out and hugged her. Finally, he put her down on the floor with the blanket. She slept deeply. Her small body was wrapped in the blanket like a cute sweet roll. Her fair face was still blushing comfortably due to the protection of the warmth magic. Shea ignored her. He had used up the last of his strength. He lay on his side on the bed softly. Once again he became a motionless statue. Wei Wei Bai's soft breathing was the only sound in the dim yellow light. In the quiet night, he stared at the ceiling. There was actually spider silk. Chapter 2506. Originally he wanted to let Wei Wei Bai sleep on the bed. After all, he had noble etiquette. It was fine for a man to give in to a woman. But now he didn't. After all, the man she wanted to take care of wasn't him. Well, in the future she dared to ask him to repay her for taking care of him. Dream on. Then Wei Wei Bai laid on the floor comfortably and slept through the night. When she woke up, she was speechless. The system told her what happened last night. She didn't know what the male lead was thinking. She could only roughly repeat what the male lead did. She looked through the house and searched for key items. Proved that she was smart and cautious. But after looking at the evidence of love between the two of them, why did he throw her on the floor? Could it be that he hated being a bootlicker? Wei Wei Bai felt that it was very possible. After all, he had seen that he had written a love letter to her, every single word. Anger rose in her heart. She felt that she was too useless in the past. Loving a woman so much might go against his character. So the favorability didn't increase? Wei Wei Bai looked deeply at the youth lying on the bed. Then she changed her expression. She touched her head blankly and got up from the floor. She looked at Shea blankly with her head full of fluffy hair. Why am I sleeping on the floor? Did I carry Shea to bed last night? She muttered a few doubtful words. She floated over lightly. Then Wei Wei Bai didn't seem to be too conflicted. She began to wash Shea's face and hands seriously. He quietly lowered his eyes, indifferent. She was like a delicate and cold doll. Wei Wei Bai didn't care. She felt that it was good to have a relationship that lasted a long time. And after experiencing the previous world, she didn't think that there was another world that could last as long as the previous one. So even if she felt that Shea's face was very bad, Wei Wei Bai was still happy to finish feeding him. Then she said to him, "Then I'll go sell the potion, Shea." Shea was speechless. If he couldn't sell it, he would be caught. Shea sat quietly, ignoring her completely. Wei Wei Bai pushed him to the window and opened it to let him bask in the sun. Then she changed into a hooded robe that ordinary people wore, and went out to sell things with a small basket. Shea heard the door close. The little witch's cheerful footsteps gradually disappeared. Wei Wei Bai, who was outside, said calmly, "The smell is far away. I took care of him every day, so he took it for granted. I can't raise him to become an ingrate. I have to let him know that I'm very important." The system said, "Yes, yes." Wei Wei Bai said, "Remember to pay more attention to your family." The system replied, "Yes, yes." Wait, he couldn't see clearly from such a distance. Fuck your Yishan dog. A lonely room, a decaying house. Without the little witch, even the sunlight was gloomy. This was the atmosphere of a normal witch's house. However, when the little witch was around, he didn't feel any aura of darkness or evil. Shaya pursed his lips and coldly lowered his head. He didn't know how much time had passed, but it was already noon. The little witch still hadn't returned. Shaya patiently waited, but the sun had already begun to set. The little witch was still nowhere to be seen. He had already changed his position a few times. His current position was lazily leaning against the back of the chair, his fingers carelessly resting on the armrest. His face was facing the shabby wooden door, his eyes cold and his posture strong and cold. He almost stared a hole in the door. Afraid of wasting too much magic, he didn't put any tracking devices on the little witch. Chapter 2507. Could it be that she was taken away by the patrol team? Thinking of the little witch's face, he knew that in recent years, the group of people in the noble circle no longer cared about overly gorgeous and strong beauty. Instead, they pursued the appearance of a fair and innocent child like an angel. This group of people was used to seeing things that were too gorgeous. In their eyes, Yenli was like a colorful, rotten, and ugly food. and the little witch's face was like a beautiful and pure light. It was enough to make a large number of nobles go crazy for her. Could it be that some blind little noble took a fancy to her? After all, she was so weak. If she was taken a fancy to, she couldn't struggle even if she was taken away. Every noble, no matter good or bad, always had a mage by their side. And with the little witch's terrible ability, not to mention the lowest level mage, even if a few ordinary men swarmed her, she couldn't handle it. Shaya was already impatiently holding his face with his hand. His cold eyes began to show sharp irritation. If she didn't come back, he was going to leave. He didn't care about her life or death. Anyway, she was a witch. A few more died or were ruined by someone. There were only benefits and no disadvantages for him. Shaya patiently tapped the armrest of the chair with his fingers. Damn it, she went out to play. She forgot about him. She didn't care if he was hungry. Thinking of this, the delicate and sarcastic youth coldly curved his thin red lips. That's right, he was just a wrong substitute she picked up. She picked up the wrong bone and brought him back by mistake. She had always regarded him as her lover. So stupid, so blind to be able to live so long. Shaya's cold heart, for no reason, surged with a ball of suppressed anger. This uncontrollable state of mind. It made him frown, and his pale eyelashes trembled. Shaya got up and was about to leave and not come back. The familiar sound of footsteps could be heard. And the little witch's happy singing voice. The sweet and sticky little tune was especially tantalizing. Shaya's cold expression was a little strange. He almost instinctively sat on the chair, then remembered that he had moved the chair. Shaya's fingers used force, turned the chair back and put it by the window. Then he breathed a sigh of relief and continued to sit like a corpse. His face was slightly lowered, thin lips soft. The young man who was as beautiful as a rose still managed to successfully play dead one day. Wei Bai held the empty basket, listening to the system talk about things at home. There was no problem. Just now, Shaya moved the chair by himself as if he didn't dare to let her know. As if he could move. Bai Weiwei felt that this was also in line with common sense. After all, this was a person with amnesia. He must be very vigilant, so he played dead and then step by step to check the surroundings. After confirming that she was telling the truth and that there was no danger, only then would he return to normal. Bai Weiwei nodded. She deliberately ignored the stalker behind her. He also wanted to make Shaya feel a sense of crisis. Otherwise, if she kept sitting like this, the favorability would not change. A beauty saving a hero, although it was an old story. But it was useful. That mage probably took a fancy to her beauty. After all, she just went out and saw a woman. All of them had rough skin. Chapter 2508. She wondered if it was because the place she went to was too poor. Even if she was a young girl, her skin was dull. It burned her eyes. She used her face as a signboard and easily sold the potion. After all, her skin was as white as a light bulb. She was a living advertisement. So those women, even if they hesitated, still bought it in the end. And that low-level mage seemed to be passing by. Then he showed a greedy look. Wei Bai was very sensitive to this kind of malicious look. But she did not bat an eyelid and lured him over. System, but he's going to molest you later, the male lead should be the one to save you. After all, the male lead could already move. Wei Bai looked indifferent. No, Shaya's appearance is much better than mine. Since that mage likes beauty, he'll definitely hug Shaya first. System, finally it struggled to refute. They're both men. Wei Bai, men? Is there a problem? System, okay, there was no problem. The host's brain circuit had always been so fresh, abstract and twisted. Wei Bai, so when he molests Shaya later, I'll use a kitchen knife to kill the mage. She had asked around. Mages were close combat trash. As long as he was not allowed to chant, he would be chopped to death by a kitchen knife in minutes. System. As long as you're happy. The host's bold plan was not just once or twice. He was used to it. Wei Bai came to the door and immediately put on a pure and sweet smile. She opened the door and excitedly walked in, even forgetting to lock the door. She ran to the window and happily spread her hands. Shaya, look, we have money. Shaya, who was pretending to be a corpse, fixed his gaze on her slender fingers. Dozens of iron coins appeared in her palm. This money was enough for 2 days of food. Shaya's gaze paused as he saw the dirt on her fingertips. It was just a small amount of money. But for some reason he felt a strange sourness in his heart. It was a little uncomfortable. However, it wasn't just uncomfortable. He kept his composure and lowered his eyes, still not revealing any flaws. However, he couldn't help but think that she had been running around outside all day. He wondered how she had managed to sell those potions. Could it be that they were begging one by one? Thinking of this, Xiaya could hardly control himself and pursed his thin lips. Wei Wei Bai had already happily placed the iron coins on the table. She chirped like a cute little bird. I'll work hard to save money to buy you new clothes. Winter is starting to get cold. You'll need a hat and a scarf. Her back was to him. He finally couldn't help but turn to look at her. He saw her running around happily. The pair of iron coins on the table was exceptionally dazzling. Meanwhile, Wei Wei Bai had already rushed to the kitchen. I can't come back at noon. I'm sorry to keep you hungry. I'll cook for you right away. Xiaya couldn't help but follow her back. His stifled breathing finally relaxed a little. Then he looked at the metal coins. He had worked so hard to earn them. Not only did she have to support him, but she also had to save clothes and scarves for him. Didn't she think that he didn't even have thick clothes to protect himself from the cold? He looked at the wardrobe. In the little witch's wardrobe, most of the men's old clothes were preserved, but it could be seen that they were old. As for her clothes, there were only a few pieces. And in the wardrobe, under some of the clothes, there was a list of pawns. She pawned all of her expensive and better-looking clothes. Thinking of the resurrection potion that had no effect on him. Perhaps for the little witch she had to go bankrupt to gather the materials. With her incomparably trashy concocting technique, it was estimated that she had wasted a lot of materials to succeed. Xiaya's incomparably cold eyes were a little puzzled. He was used to seeing selfish people, the little witch's spirit of sacrificing everything for love. He had never seen it before. That man, how good was he to be worthy of her treatment? Xiaya's eyelashes suddenly moved and immediately lowered again. Wei Wei Bai had already walked out with dinner, which was much more sumptuous than last night. Xiaya, it's time to eat. Xiaya sat quietly, and his eyes didn't tremble in the slightest. She fed him meat soup still full of smiles. I will take care of you, Xiaya. Xiaya's lips trembled, and the light in his eyes finally fluctuated a few times. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 30. To facilitate the next reading, you can click on Chapter 2509. She heard the favorability prompt. Wei Wei Bai's smile became even more brilliant. Xiaya's little corpse's reaction is slow. The favorability is rising so slowly, it's obvious that he's a slow person. Maybe it's because he's been dead for too long, his brain lacks oxygen, resulting in his brain not working well. The favorability can't rise quickly. So, little by little, there will occasionally be a surprise. That was the right way to go about it. Wei Wei Bai lowered her eyes, trying to make the minced meat more finely. Like an old mother feeding a mentally disabled child, she showed it to the fullest. Her beautiful fingers, because of holding the spoon so tightly, turned white. Xiaya's frozen gaze fell, he looked at it expressionlessly. Then he heard a series of footsteps that clearly harbored ill intentions. It's the aura of a fire mage. And it's a very low-level one. Why is there a mage here? Is it his enemy? No, he doesn't have such a low-level enemy. Or is it the little witch's enemy? It's just her first day selling things and she's already attracted such a person with bad intentions. The youth's cold purple eyes turned gloomy. Because he already smelled a faint sweet fragrance in the air. This is a cheap aphrodisiac. Why use this? Wei Wei Bai was still smiling. The system notified that the mage had arrived. She immediately tidied up the plates. Xiaya, I'm going to wash the plates, I'll come out later to wash your face. She treated him as if he was a big cute doll. Xiaya didn't say anything, he didn't even move his gaze. Wei Wei Bai went to put the plates to let the mage in. While she was at it, she went to the kitchen to find a knife. Wei Wei Bai weighed the tools in the kitchen. Although the meat knife was thin, it was sharp. So Wei Wei Bai held the meat knife and said to the system, as long as the mage comes in and shows a trace of bad intentions towards Xiaya, you tell me. She immediately rushed out. The beauty saved the youth. The system nodded. In the living room, Xiaya lazily raised his eyelids. There was a cold and cruel aura in her eyes. Her purple pupils gave off a bloody and gorgeous feeling. The beautiful young man finally turned his head slightly. His calm eyes stared at the door. The door swayed slightly. Then it was opened. Xiaya narrowed his eyes dangerously. It seemed that he was not an enemy, but a piece of trash coveting the little witch. The cheap sweet smell in the air. He pursed his lips coldly. It was too disgusting. That low-level fire magician had already walked in with a face full of determination. When he saw Wei Wei Bai for the first time, he was stunned. He had never seen such a pure and beautiful girl before. Her skin was as white as snow in early winter. Those beautiful eyes were like a gem in the hands of a noble. Such a young girl could be auctioned off for a sky-high price in the aristocratic circle. As soon as he saw her, he became greedy. As long as he caught her, he would be rich. He could also rely on this wealth to advance to become an intermediate mage. If he was lucky, he might even gain the favor of a great mage and enter the circle of mage nobles. The mage revealed a wretched smile. The sweet fragrance in the air would make the girl lose her strength. Moreover, she could not resist the touch of a man. Before selling her, of course, he had to taste it himself. When he walked in, he suddenly felt that something was wrong. The air was a little suffocating. He saw a young man sitting on a chair by the window. To TXT download to read the. To facilitate your next reading, you can click on the. Chapter 25:10. This young man was so beautiful that it was hard to distinguish his gender. If it was the girl just now, the purest snow in early winter, then this young man was simply the most gorgeous rose. The beauty of both of them was another kind of extreme perfection. And this young man's beauty had a terrifying feeling of sharpness. But was it an illusion? Why did he feel like he had seen this young man before? The mage frowned strangely, but he didn't think too much about it. After all, he found two beautiful young men and women at once. His future was bright. He grinned and was about to reach out his hand. Suddenly he couldn't breathe. The mage was horrified to find that his face was covered by a thin golden paper. This was light magic. At the lowest level, the light spots condensed into a ball. But this young man's control skills were in the realm of God. He condensed the simple light spots into a piece of light paper. He tried his best to remove the golden paper from his face. But it was useless. Light had no substance. He couldn't even feel the weight of the paper. But he couldn't breathe. He reached out his hand and tried to use hand gestures to attract the flames. Unable to speak, the gestures were much more complicated. But he couldn't move his fingers. A few golden chains bound him. Just like that, the exquisite and beautiful young man sat quietly on the chair. He muttered in a low voice, "Are you going to use flames? That won't do. The little witch is so poor. If you burn something, won't she be heartbroken?" After saying that, the young man gently snapped his fingers. Then his thin red lips said softly and elegantly, "Destroy, disgusting criminal." The golden rays of light suddenly dispersed. The mage's body was also broken into light spots. All of a sudden, a human-shaped light spot appeared. It was a human figure struggling in incomparable pain. Then it began to fade away. Not a trace was left. When the light spot landed, Shaya's cold purple eyes suddenly constricted. Because he saw that at the kitchen door. Wei Wei Bai was carrying a knife. She seemed to have heard something and came out to see. But he didn't make any sound. He didn't give the criminal a chance to speak. The whole process should have been silent. Why did she hear it? And Wei Wei Bai in the system. She was waiting for the mage to come in and show a covetous expression at Shaya. She was ready to rush out. But when she walked out of the kitchen, she saw a struggling light spot human figure being destroyed. That scene was too shocking. Too strange and gorgeous. As a result, Bai Weiwei held the knife and forgot to rush to the rescue. But when she bumped into Shaya's body and moved, the quiet house, the disappearing criminal, the gorgeous young man was still sitting on the chair. Instead, it made the little witch look rather pitiful. It was to the point the scene was awkward. Shaya was stiff for a long time before his fingers finally fell on the armrest of the chair. Then he looked down coldly, although the power of the Saint Bone had not been completely digested. But it was more or less enough for him to divide his magic power to move around. Therefore, he did not need the little witch to take care of him. Shaya pursed his lips and gently raised his eyelashes. A trace of sober choice appeared in his silent and cold purple eyes. It was time to say goodbye to her. Even though her care wasn't necessary. And she obviously thought of him as someone else. But it was fine to give her some money before she left. At https://www.sashu.com/ to read the full article at https://www.sashu.com to txt download at https://www.sashu.com to read on the phone at https://m/sashu.com// for the convenience of your next reading, you can click on Chapter 25:11. Just take it as a gift to this poor little girl. After Shaya made up his mind, he slowly got up and casually tugged at the rough collar of his clothes. His every move had a hint of casual elegance. His eyes also started to become unusually cold and domineering. I am Shaya West, the Duke of the Empire, blah blah blah. A choked sob of disbelief interrupted his magnificent self-introduction. Shaya, you can move? Tears of excitement welled up in Wei Bai's eyes. Her fingers loosened and the knife fell to the floor. Shaya was stunned and was about to explain. Wei Bai took a few steps forward and hugged his waist with tears all over her face. Her whole body trembled and her voice broke. You're alive, you're finally alive, I finally saved you. Shaya could feel her tears soaking through his shirt in front of his chest. After the warm tears left her eyes, they became abnormally cold. Shaya even felt that he was a little cold. Bai Weiwei's hands gripped the clothes around his waist, her fingertips turning white from exertion. She accidentally exposed Shaya's lie. Who knew if he would fly into a rage out of humiliation and run away? She had to catch him first. To catch him, she had to think of a reason to rush over and hug him. It was all because she was too slow and the plan to save the beauty was ruined. Bai Weiwei eagerly raised her eyes. Her eyes were filled with clear and joyful tears. It was as if she had found a treasure that she had lost for many years. The feeling of regaining what she had lost made her unable to suppress her feelings. Her lips trembled with excitement, and she cried and hiccuped. I lost you for so many days I even felt like dying. Shaya's cold purple eyes looked at her without saying a word. It was as if he was indifferent. Wei Bai didn't care at all and hugged him intimately. Like an obedient kitten, she rubbed against his chest and said obediently, I've been protecting myself well, waiting for you to come back, Shaya. Shaya tried to open his mouth a few times, but he was interrupted by her sobbing. Her voice was soft and resolute. It's good that you're awake. If you want to leave next time, take me with you. If you die, take me with you. Shaya stood straight, still not saying anything. Did she not realize that she had mistaken him for someone else? Was she really blind, or did she refuse to admit that the man she loved was already dead? Furthermore, she did not mention at all the sacrifices she had made to make the resurrection potion. Not to mention the care she had given him during this period of time. This made him think that she wanted to use the method of repaying a debt of gratitude to blackmail his Grand Duke Rose. He was at a loss. Could it be that, in this world, there was really someone who loved someone without caring about anything in return? This kind of love that burned into his heart and drilled into his bones. It was as turbulent as a hurricane. Shaya didn't know how to deal with it at all. Now he was telling her that she had the wrong person and that the man was dead. Was she going to die with him? Thinking of this, Shaya frowned uncomfortably. He reached out to push her away. Wei Bai had already let go of his clothes. She hurriedly reached out to wipe her tears. After wiping her eyes until they were red, she opened her rabbit eyes timidly and revealed a cute smile. Welcome back, Shaya. Her eyes, which were full of traces of crying, were shining brightly at this moment. Shaya choked on the words in his mouth again. To make it easier for you to read it next time, you can click. Chapter 25:12. He had clearly made up his mind to find an opportunity to tell her coldly and indifferently. She had mistaken him for someone else. The man she wanted was already dead. Although he didn't know how she picked him up in his undead state. Her casual treatment was an exceptionally shameless and despicable act. His identity was as different as heaven and earth from hers. She used him as a puppet substitute. He would not let such a serious crime of blasphemy against the nobles of the empire go easily. Until she realized what she had done wrong and sincerely knelt down to repent. This was the revenge he wanted from the beginning. Wei Bai suddenly put her hands behind her back and raised her head. Her soft hair fell behind her shoulders. She pursed her bright red lips, and her thin white face was dyed with a beautiful blush. Where's the kiss of return? Shaya looked at her expressionlessly, but there was a strange emotion in his eyes. Kiss of return? Wei Bai tilted her head. There were still traces of tears in the corners of her eyes, but her smile was more beautiful than a garden full of roses. You said that the first thing you would do when you came back was to kiss me. Shaya's quiet purple eyes stared at her just like that. He didn't speak and didn't show any emotion. It was as if he was really a puppet just standing up. Wei Bai's eyes, which were full of anticipation and laughter, gradually showed a trace of gloominess. Her smile also stiffened a little. As if sensing her decadence, she immediately reached out and patted her face. Then she said happily, "It's okay. You can owe me first. I don't mind." She didn't seem to want him to see her pain at all. So she tried her best to look energetic. She didn't want to burden him. Shaya saw her drooping eyelashes and deep disappointment in her eyes. but the corners of her mouth were still curled up. It was as if others couldn't see her fear and discomfort. It was because his reaction wasn't right. So she started to be afraid. Was there something wrong with him? Shaya didn't know what was wrong with him. He felt that the little witch was more pleasing to the eye when she was happier. Didn't he go out to sell the potion today and get a few days' worth of food expenses? Although that was something that could be bought with food expenses. It was so shabby that he didn't like it. But she always left the meat for him to eat. For the poor little witch, this was already the best she could do to support him. The girl hesitantly rubbed her feet against the floor. Then she tried to make her voice sound more energetic. You know what, Shaya, I sold something today and have money. When I have enough money we will leave this place and be together forever. Speaking of being together, she seemed to have thought of something and tears welled up in her eyes again. Shaya saw that she was trying hard to raise her spirits so that he wouldn't see her suffering, but she was also pretending that she wasn't feeling well. His tears were about to flow again. He sighed in annoyance. Then he reached out and snapped his fingers. The surroundings brightened and warmed up. Wei Bai looked up strangely, seemingly a little surprised. When she looked up, a fair and slender finger lifted her chin with strength and elegance. The youth had already lowered his head. His lips were as red as a rose, and beneath his pale eyelashes was a pair of cold purple eyes. They were filled with indifference and suppressed helplessness. He kissed her. A restrained, courteous kiss. But with the breath of his thin lips, it was strong and slightly cold. Wei Bai's eyes widened, but she didn't have time to feel anything. He had already taken a step back and retracted his delicate fingers. The handsome youth, with a cold and noble temperament, in the warm and bright room. His voice sounded indifferent and seductive. Return kiss. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 35. Chapter 25:13. The room was full of light. At this moment he was as dark as a demon. Then he smiled, and for the first time his extreme beauty was revealed in front of the girl. Don't be so unguarded in the future, or my temper won't be as good as this time. If there was a next time he might really do something irreparable to her. Just as he finished speaking, the youth's finger moved in the air. The light suddenly burned. Not a single flame touched the furniture. But the sweet fragrance in the air was completely swept away by the burning power. Soon the wind outside blew in. It blew away the loose hair in front of Shaya's forehead, revealing the youth's stunning purple eyes. His face was still flushed red. His breathing was also a little messy. Then he stretched out his fingers and pressed on her neck. He found that her skin was still hot. Shaya half closed his eyes and leaned forward, touching her forehead with his forehead. He whispered bewitchingly, "Sleep, my girl?" Wei Bai's eyes were still confused, and she was in a trance for a moment. Unable to resist his magic power, she slowly closed her eyes and finally fell asleep. The youth still maintained the posture of leaning forward and pressing his fingers on her neck. He saw that she was sleeping peacefully. The sweetness in the air was also gone. His rationality finally returned a little. Shaya lightly breathed a sigh of relief as if he had just fought a battle. But his heart was still beating fast. Then he finally bent down and picked her up. His movements were extremely gentle, as if he was holding a feather, or as if he was holding his treasure. Ding, the male lead's favorability is 45. After covering Wei Bai with a blanket, Shaya took a deep look at her sleeping face before he turned around and walked out. He was worried that he couldn't suppress his impulse and did something worse than a beast. As he walked, he buttoned his collar. Until the last button was meticulously buttoned, almost to his Adam's apple. Then he came to the window. After a while of the cold wind, he finally suppressed his accelerated heartbeat and the burning of his skin. Shaya didn't check the whole room last time. This time he continued to check. Although the little witch wasn't harmful. However, her witch mother might have left some traps behind. Also, he wanted to take a look. The man who had the same initials as him and was also a noble. Who was it? As long as they were nobles, he would recognize them. If they didn't recognize him, then it meant that his territory was too small and not worth mentioning. Several noble names that started with "S" flashed through his mind. But none of them matched this man's profile. Could it be that he was really a poor and worthless nobleman? Shaya unhurriedly flipped through the important books in a planned manner. At first, he only saw some of the books that the man annotated. From the looks of it, his magic talent was decent. Of course, he was still a far cry from him. With a harsh and cold attitude, Shaya examined the information. Then he checked the things again. Some of the more dangerous small objects. It should have been left behind by the little witch's mother. He casually used light magic and turned it into light before disappearing into thin air. The little witch didn't know how to use these things and they might even hurt her. Destruction was the best. Shaya also saw some men's things such as cufflinks and noble corsage for men. There were also some small gemstone decorations. These things could actually be used to repay debts and allow him to live a good life. But it seemed that the little witch didn't have this concept. She just left them there and didn't touch them at all. How foolish of him. She was already dead. Why not pawn these things and use them to take up space? Shaya wanted to destroy them, but he felt that he was too narrow-minded. After all, these things weren't his. Of course, he accidentally crushed a few of them, but that was an accident, right? When he was almost done searching, he casually picked up a book. It was a beginner witch book. Shaya casually flipped through it. He saw the little witch's handwriting. The handwriting was very slender, but it was very standard. He thought that he would see the witch's magic notes, but the first sentence was, "Shaya, I like you so much. Today is another day of loving you deeply. Shaya." And Wei Wei Bai, who was sleeping, was having a beautiful dream. Shaya didn't like to be a bootlicker, right? Then let her write a confession full of words. It would be best to create evidence that she was the one chasing after him. Let him find this evidence by himself, he would definitely feel refreshed. Unusually happy. Then her favorability would continue to rise. Shaya read the beginner witch's notes again. No wonder the witch's magic was so bad. It turned out that when she was studying, she was thinking about how to pursue a man. Shaya expressionlessly squeezed the book and crushed it little by little. She really is a bad student who doesn't like to study. Chapter 25:14. Wei Wei Bai squatted on a small stool with a strange expression on her face as she looked at the fire. Gravy was simmering on the fire. She weighed some seasonings in her hands. The food of the poor in this plain was very, very simple. The seasonings were just salt and a little bit of spice. The effect of her work was very good. She ate it herself and felt that the taste was not bad. See, didn't you not have a stomachache? When she was about to put the seasonings into the broth, the system stared at her like a tiger watching its prey. Just put it down like this. Yes, you don't have to do anything, just throw it in like this. Wei Wei Bai casually threw it in. The broth glowed with a faint blue light. The system looked at the pot of broth. Fortunately, the host had been eating bread. The broth was rarely drunk, although the ingredients were too simple. So the broth didn't have any strange changes. But the taste was definitely not good. The host also ate very little, so the tragedy of diarrhea did not happen. Fortunately, the male lead ate it. Wei Wei Bai finished cooking and brought out the bread, broth, and some dried meat. The bread was bought and the dried meat was not needed. It was just that the broth took a little longer. As the witch's little wife, Wei Wei Bai walked out with a smile. Shaya, it's time to eat. Walking out of the kitchen, she saw the young man standing by the table, lightly touching the oil lamp with his fingertips. Whoosh! The light was bright. This was not a flame that an oil lamp could have. It was a blessing of light magic. In the light, the young man's eyes under his eyelashes were as rich and deep as violets. He looked up at her unhurriedly. He saw Wei Wei Bai happily putting the food on the table like a happy little bird. She had a ponytail and wore a simple dress, just like any other girl from a normal family. She was doing the housework. This feeling was very novel. Because the place where he lived was dazzling and there were all kinds of servants. He had never seen such a life. Shaya reached out and lit the candle unhurriedly. Some were incomplete, some were short, and some were even used to the point where there was only one core left. They were all lit up. There was no need to use candles or oil lamps themselves. All of them were light magic. It looked like flames, but it was actually light. In an instant, the room was incomparably bright. The flames in the fireplace started to burn automatically. The warm and cozy house was like thousands of happy families. After setting up the lamp, Shaya gracefully walked to the table. He extended his long arm and pulled a chair over. Then he said to Wei Wei Bai, "Sit. Ladies first." This was the tradition of the nobles, although he had never followed it. Regardless of whether it was a man or a woman, who would dare to take precedence in front of him. It was a provocation to him. This made it clear to everyone that Shaya was the least gentlemanly person in the aristocratic circle. First of all, no one would be able to sit on it. Wei Wei Bai sat down in a daze. The other party's attitude was too strong. His words were like an order. As Wei Wei Bai, who walked the path of a long-term and heartwarming strategy, she had already confirmed that her character was gentle and affectionate. As long as the side quest isn't too much, don't think about that little bitch. It comes as soon as he thinks about it. It simply makes people gnash their teeth in hatred but they can't bite it. Wei Wei Bai was silent for a while before she heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately there was no reminder. Xiaya had already sat across the table. The table was very small and the two of them sat facing each other. He didn't even need to stretch out his hand to touch her fingertips. This was the smallest table he had ever used. Xiaya calmly scooped up the meat soup with a spoon and put it into his mouth. Chapter 25:15. His sense of taste had not recovered yet. Previously he had been eating whatever she fed him. Sometimes after eating he would feel uncomfortable. But he would be fine after using healing magic. After all, he was very sure that the food was not poisonous. If it was, it would not escape his magic check. Perhaps it was because the power in his body was still being digested, which caused the discomfort. Wei Wei Bai felt very good about her cooking skills. The cooking methods of this plane reminded her of the minimalist cuisine of the British Empire in reality. So she followed suit and it was actually edible. To her this was simply crying tears of joy. Like a child eager to be praised, she looked at Xiaya with shining eyes. "Is it delicious, Xiaya?" Xiaya paused. What should he say? He couldn't taste it at all. But he saw that the corners of the girl's eyes were red and beautiful, as if the stars had fallen into her eyes. She actually looked so. A strange emotion surged in his heart, causing his breathing to become heavier once again. He said indifferently, "It's delicious." Although he was talking about food, his eyes were fixed on her smile. He thought of the scumbag who had followed her. This kind of scumbag would not be cut off. With such a beautiful face, any man who saw it would not be able to escape. Thinking of this, Xiaya frowned. Of course he was an exception. He was still at the stage of watching a play. He wanted to see if one day he got tired of this substitute game. He would directly tell her that she had mistaken him for someone else. Her expression must be very beautiful. Xiaya thought darkly. Letting him be a substitute, this kind of sin, he would not let her have an easy time. As for how to make it difficult for her, the Duke who had used all kinds of cruel methods to deal with a bunch of criminals. For a moment he was at a loss for words. There were many ways to make it difficult, not necessarily torture. He calmly and childishly suppressed his doubts and continued to eat the meat soup. His body felt a little uncomfortable again. Besides looking a little ugly, there should be no problem with the meat soup. The Duke calmly cast a healing light magic on himself. His body recovered. Then he continued to eat. Wei Wei Bai was eating bread. The system advised her not to eat too much meat soup. After all, meat soup is expensive. We have to pretend to be poor and pitiful. Xiaya. You eat bread and he eats meat. The more good she was to him, the more her favorability would increase. Wei Wei Bai agreed. Of course she would never admit that the broth tasted bad. After all, she was the one who made the food that was edible. She had a very good filter. He felt that his culinary skills had improved. When she returned to reality, she would cook for her family and show them how outstanding she was. Both parties were satisfied with the meal. Although one of them basically didn't eat and the other had lost his sense of taste. After dinner, Wei Wei Bai cleaned up the table and picked up the ingredients she bought to make the beautifying water. She was sure that there would be a market for her beauty lotion. The first time was harder to sell, but the second time was easier. Because it was really effective, and for effective beauty products, it was impossible for them not to sell. It took time to develop feelings in this plane. How could he survive if he didn't have more skills to earn money? As for Xiaya, he looked like an aristocrat when he was alive. Commonly known as the kind of person whose brain is not necessarily developed and whose limbs are definitely not diligent. What could he do to make money? And because the information was incomplete, Wei Wei Bai was worried that she would take him out. If she met his acquaintances or family members or something, it would be troublesome. Chapter 25:16. Wei Wei Bai was absent-minded for a moment, so she used a little strength in her fingers. Seeing that the material was about to be scrapped again. Hooking her waist with one hand, the boy gently bent down and stretched out his other hand from behind to hold her fingers. His fingertips exerted force and a trace of magic fell into the material. The scrapped material miraculously became intact, and soon the beautifying water was done. His voice sounded in her ear, "In the future when making things with magic, you must be completely focused." Wei Wei Bai didn't say anything. Xiaya thought that she couldn't hear clearly, so he couldn't help but patiently repeat. "Don't be distracted." This was her bad habit, otherwise she wouldn't have scrapped so many materials. Wei Wei Bai blinked and her face turned red. Her voice was low and muffled. Xiaya frowned. What's wrong? Wei Wei Bai murmured, You are by my side, I can't concentrate. This sentence was very quiet. Xiaya listened attentively and realized what she meant. His fingers stiffened, and the girl's slender body was almost held in his arms. The tip of his nose smelled the familiar sweet fragrance of her body. This kind of contact was indeed very intimate and natural. Xiaya's face was also red, but he still calmly said, If you can't concentrate, then don't concentrate. With that, he let go of her fingers and pulled her arm instead. Taking her out of the chair, he sat down in a natural manner. Then Xiaya bowed his head, and his hands quickly and accurately began to make the beautifying water she wanted. I'll do it, you just look at the fire. If it's going to go out, remember to add firewood. Indeed, there was nothing he wanted her to do. The fire was added with magic and it couldn't be extinguished all night. This was just a reason he wanted her to continue to not concentrate and think about him. Wei Wei Bai immediately nodded, and then obediently looked at the fire. For this kind of beautifying water, Xiaya casually made it, and his distraction was more powerful than Wei Wei Bai's. But because of the difference in magic, there was basically no possibility of failure. Xiaya quickly made a beautifying lotion and casually looked up. She saw that Wei Wei Bai was really looking at the fire obediently. She didn't even look at him. Xiaya. He casually made another beautifying lotion. However, Wei Wei Bai continued to stare at the fire obediently. She was so obedient. Why did he feel so uncomfortable? Xiaya couldn't help but crush a piece of material. Wei Wei Bai's eyelashes trembled. She immediately looked over and saw the shattered material in Xiaya's hand. It was the most expensive one. Wei Wei Bai couldn't help but say, It's okay if it's broken. I've broken it many times too. Xiaya pinched the broken material. Then, he silently picked up the beautifying lotion and shook it. Wei Wei Bai was silent for a while before she finally understood what he meant. In almost a second, a trace of a smile appeared on her indifferent expression. Then, an exaggerated smile appeared on his face. Xiaya, you're so amazing. You finished it so quickly. Xiaya. Wait, what did he do? Holding the lowest grade beautifying lotion and showing it to Wei Wei Bai like a student craving praise? Even at his best, he didn't care about anyone's evaluation. Not to mention those old farts in the academy. Also, wasn't her smile a little too forced? Chapter 25:17. Xiaya squeezed the beautifying water tightly and then released it, worried that it would break again. Then his thin lips lightly sighed as if he disdainfully lowered his eyes. This thing, I can make 10,000 of them a day. After saying that, he really wanted to swallow his words. Why would he make these broken things? If it wasn't to play with her, he wouldn't even touch these cheap things. Wei Wei Bai supported her face with both hands and stared at him face to face. Her eyes were clear and soft, as deep as the sea. She couldn't help but smile, and her voice was soft and sweet. Yes, my Xiaya is the most powerful. The love and worship in her eyes were not hidden, and were more beautiful than the flames. Xiaya looked up, his eyes fixed on her face for a while, and then suddenly lowered his eyelashes in a daze. He was silent for a moment and then lightly snorted. Who is yours? The girl looked at him sweetly. The light and shadow were beautiful, her face like a flower. And? If you don't like this, then? Her face was close to him, her delicate skin was like snow, and her long eyelashes trembled. She slowly said, I am Xiaya's, that's fine too. These words were too casual. It was like a joking tone. But the affection in her eyes didn't have the slightest intention of joking. Xiaya's breath stopped as if he was stunned. After a long time, he continued to focus on the beautifying water in his hand. It seemed like the beautifying water was easy to make just now. But now it was bumpy and became extremely difficult. He accidentally broke some of the materials. He looked at Wei Wei Bai with some embarrassment, but found that the little witch was staring at the fire. It was as if she would always listen to and abide by his every word. Something in his heart was breaking out of its shell. It seemed to be sweet but also bitter. Xiaya couldn't tell, but he didn't have the strength to stop it. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 50. When sleeping, Xiaya lay directly on the chair in the hall. A few chairs were barely enough to form a single narrow bed. He put his hands behind his head and carefully listened to the sounds in the room without sleeping. She was asleep. Her breathing was unusually even. Xiaya felt that this game seemed to be out of control. She didn't love him. It was the man who couldn't be any more dead. Who was that man? He didn't think that in this world there was anyone who looked similar to him and wasn't famous. Furthermore, he was in the aristocratic circle. Xiaya was thinking when he suddenly heard something. He immediately got up and went to the window. The window opened. A man wearing a white hooded robe was kneeling respectfully. Lord Duke. It was the leader of the Church of Light, the Archbishop. Shaya's soft emotions were swept away. The young man's expression was indifferent, and his temperament was cold and ruthless. How have you been? The Archbishop immediately said, There is an internal strife in the palace. His Majesty has no time to take care of the Duke. Shaya said, Let them continue fighting. If he didn't make use of the king's sons, how could he make the king, that old bastard, suffer? The Archbishop nodded, then respectfully held Shaya's hand and touched it with his forehead. This was a great gesture of submission. Without waiting for the Archbishop to say anything like a blessing of light and other flattering words, suddenly there was a sound from the door. Shaya's expression changed, and he extended his leg to kick the Archbishop away. The window immediately closed automatically. He quickly lay down on the chair and didn't wait to close his eyes. He saw Wei Wei Bai's head poke out from behind the door. Shaya, did you hear something? Shaya replied coldly, No. Wei Wei Bai smiled. Maybe it's the wind. After saying that, she suddenly ran over with a soft blanket and placed it on his body. She lowered her head and kissed his cheek, then said with a sweet smile, Good night, Shaya. After saying that, she happily turned around and ran into the room. Shaya was silent. Then he pulled the blanket and pursed his lips. But he couldn't suppress the smile on his face. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 55. Is at https://www.sashu.com// Chapter 25:18. Wei Wei Bai put bottles of beautifying water into a small basket. She said happily, As long as we sell these, we can buy a few more clothes. Shaya sat on the chair casually and elegantly. The old chair was cushioned with red velvet. The beautiful young man's features were cold and exquisite, and there was a thick magic book on his lap. His pale eyelashes were dyed beautifully in the morning light. Hearing Wei Wei Bai's words, he looked up at her unhurriedly. The little witch was still wearing a simple hooded robe, and her thick hair was still unadorned. His gaze rested on her beautiful thick hair for a few seconds. He felt that even without any decorations, she was much better looking than those noble women full of flowers and feathers. As if he didn't care, his voice was low. What did I used to be? He was already acting as if he had amnesia. The little witch didn't suspect anything. After all, she was clear about the aftereffects of those drugs. She felt that it was fine as long as he could come back to life. She didn't seem to care that his personality had changed drastically and that he had lost his memory. She didn't realize that she had resurrected the wrong person. Wei Wei Bai was silent for a moment, and a trace of sadness appeared in her eyes. Shaya used to be a noble. Shaya seemed a little surprised, but his eyes were calm. Then what about my family? Wei Wei Bai racked her brains, thinking about how to make up a story. It wasn't difficult to fool a person with amnesia. But to fool a person with amnesia who obviously wanted to find his family, she couldn't make up a story. Wei Wei Bai thought about it, and in the end she was tired. Forget it. Anyway, he had amnesia, so she could continue to fool him. A lie needed 10,000 lies to round it out. The white drama queen meant that 100 million lies were a piece of cake. So Wei Wei Bai looked sad. Shaya doesn't have a family. A series of noble names flashed through Shaya's mind. Nobles without families were pitifully few. After all, noble families were huge and they had to be the only one left. Not possible. Unless it was because of a crime and the whole family died together. Could it be that the man she loved was actually a criminal? As if she was afraid that he would be sad, the little witch pursed her lips and didn't say anything else. She just hurriedly carried the small basket and put on the hood. Her long hair fell out of the hood, and her small and fair face was unbelievably beautiful under the shadow of the hood. Then I'll leave first, Shaya. It was as if she was afraid that he would ask more questions. She turned around and ran. Shaya's eyes darkened until the little witch closed the door and her footsteps gradually faded away. Only then did he stretch out his finger and touch the page. Find a man who has the same name as me and looks like me. He might be a minor noble, but his family has been wiped out. After saying that, he extended his finger. His fingertips were hooked around the old pocket watch, but it could be seen that it belonged to a noble. This belongs to him. If he dies, give me the information. The Archbishop appeared from the shadows. He bowed his head respectfully and stretched out his hands, preparing to take the pocket watch. His voice was steady and sincere. Yes, Your Grace. What if he's still alive? Alive? Shaya didn't think of this possibility. After all, if the little witch resurrected him, didn't that mean that her lover was dead? Shaya was silent for a long time. In the incomparably cold atmosphere, the archbishop seemed to feel the power of the magic in the air surging. A layer of cold sweat appeared on his back. Did he say something wrong? Shaya lowered his eyes. His purple eyes were so cold that the bottom couldn't be seen. His fingers moved and the pocket watch fell into the archbishop's hand. Then it was as if he had said something unimportant. If he's alive, then kill him. His words were calm and casual, but there was a murderous aura that made people shudder. To facilitate your next reading, you can click on .you're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.